The snow came early that year, falling heavy and mean across the high country like it had a grudge to settle. By late October, the Wyoming timberlands were already locked in winter's teeth, the kind of cold that turned your breath to ice before it left your lips, and made the silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat echoing off the frozen pines. Elena Voss had stopped feeling her feet 2 hours ago, maybe 3. Time had lost its shape somewhere back in the trees, back where the screaming had finally stopped and the smell of gunpowder still hung in the air like a ghost nobody wanted to name. She stumbled over a root she couldn't see, went down hard on her knees. The pain shot through her legs, but she barely registered it, just another ache in a body that had become nothing but a catalog of hurts. Her dress, what remained of it, was stiff with dried blood. Some of it was hers. Most of it wasn't. Get up, she told herself. The voice in her head sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Get up or die here. She'd been telling herself that for hours now, ever since she'd crawled out from under the overturned supply wagon and realized she was the only one still breathing. The only one the raiders had missed in their hurry to strip the caravan and vanish back into the mountains before the territorial patrol could arrive. 12 people. 12 lives ended in less time than it took to boil coffee. Elena pushed herself to her feet, swayed, caught herself against a tree trunk. The bark felt like razors against her torn palms, but she held on anyway, using the pain to keep herself conscious. Somewhere ahead, through the wall of trees and falling snow, there had to be something. A settlement. A ranch. A line shack where miners or trappers holed up for the winter. Anything. The alternative was freezing to death out here, and she'd survived too much in the last 6 hours to let the cold finish what the raiders had started. She made herself walk. One step, then another. Her left ankle screamed every time she put weight on it, probably sprained when she'd thrown herself from the wagon during the first volley of gunfire. The wound along her ribs had stopped bleeding, but the fabric of her dress kept sticking to it, pulling fresh whenever she moved. There was something wrong with her right shoulder, too, a deep grinding ache that suggested bone meeting bone in ways bone wasn't meant to meet. None of it mattered. Keep walking or die. Those were the choices. The trees began to thin. She almost didn't notice at first, too focused on putting one foot in front of the other, but gradually the darkness overhead gave way to the marginally lighter darkness of open sky. The snow was falling harder now, thick wet flakes that clung to her hair and eyelashes, but through it she could see something that made her heart lurch in her chest. Light. Faint and distant, barely more than a suggestion of warmth in all that frozen dark, but unmistakably there. Lamplight, which meant people, which meant shelter, which meant she might actually survive this. Elena tried to run and managed 3 stumbling steps before her legs gave out entirely. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs, lay there gasping like a fish thrown on a riverbank. The snow felt almost warm against her face. That was bad, she knew distantly. That meant she was too cold, that her body was starting to shut down, that she was running out of time. She rolled onto her back, stared up at the sky. The snow fell into her open eyes, and she didn't even blink. This is how it ends, she thought. Close enough to see salvation, but too broken to reach it. Then something in her chest. Some stubborn, furious core that had kept her alive through poverty and loss and a cross-country journey that had killed stronger people than her, simply refused to accept it. No. She rolled back onto her stomach, got her hands under her, pushed. The world spun, and her vision went gray at the edges, but she made it to her knees. Then, using a boulder she couldn't remember crawling to, she dragged herself upright one more time. The light was closer now, close enough that she could make out its source. Not one lamp, but several, burning in the windows of what looked like a substantial building. A house. A big one by the look of it, with other structures looming dark around it. Barns, maybe. Outbuildings. A ranch. Elena started walking again. She had no clear memory of crossing the last 100 yards. One moment she was staring at those distant lights. The next she was standing in what appeared to be a large yard, surrounded by fenced corrals and silent buildings. The main house rose before her like something out of a fever dream, 2 stories of solid timber construction with a wide porch and real glass in the windows. She made it 3 steps toward that porch before her legs quit for good. This time when she fell, she didn't get up. Inside Black Hollow Ranch, Silas Mercer was trying to explain to his foreman why they couldn't afford to lose any more cattle to the early freeze. I don't care if the north pastures drifted 6 feet deep, he said, refilling his whiskey glass with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to measure his vices. We move the herd south tomorrow, or we'll be counting losses come spring that'll make this year's numbers look charitable. Tom Bridger, who'd been running cattle for Silas for the better part of 15 years, shook his head. Moving them in this weather's asking to lose animals anyway. Snow this heavy, we could lose half the calves just in the push. Then we lose half. Better than losing them all. Silas, the discussion's over, Tom. Silas didn't raise his voice. He never did. 20 years of building an empire and country that ate lesser men for breakfast had taught him that real authority didn't need volume. Get the boys ready to ride at first light. Something hit the porch outside. Not a knock. Wrong sound for that. More like dead weight dropping. Both men went still. Probably just snow sliding off the roof, Tom said, but his hand had already moved to the revolver at his hip. Silas was already moving toward the door. He pulled it open, letting in a blast of freezing air and snow, and looked down. For a moment his mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. It didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. People didn't just appear out of the high country in the middle of a snowstorm in late October. People didn't crawl out of the timberlands half dead and collapse on his doorstep like some kind of biblical test he hadn't asked for. But there she was anyway. A woman. Young, though it was hard to tell under all the blood and dirt and God knew what else. Her dress was torn to rags, her hair matted with pine needles and ice. One of her hands was still reaching forward, fingers curled like she'd been trying to drag herself those last few inches to the door. Jesus Christ, Tom breathed, appearing beside him. Silas was already kneeling, his hand going to the woman's throat, searching for a pulse. Found it, thin and rapid and desperately weak, but there. She alive? Tom asked. Barely. Silas slid his arms under her, lifted. She weighed almost nothing, or maybe that was just how strong fear made a man. Get Doc Morrison, now. Silas, we don't know who she is or what. I said now, Tom. The foreman hesitated 1 second longer, then grabbed his coat and disappeared into the storm. Silas carried the woman inside, kicked the door shut behind him. The heat from the fireplace hit her frozen skin and she made a sound, low and hurt, like an animal that had given up on being saved. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. He laid her on the long leather sofa near the fire, started checking for injuries. The blood told most of the story, a deep gash along her ribs that had soaked half her dress, smaller cuts on her hands and face, bruises darkening across her arms and throat. Her right shoulder sat wrong, probably dislocated. Her ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. But she was breathing. That was something. Silas grabbed blankets from the bedroom, piled them over her, found clean cloth and warm water, and started cleaning the worst of the wounds as best he could. He'd done field medicine before. You didn't run a ranch this size without learning how to deal with injuries too serious to wait for a doctor and too minor to justify a bullet. But this was different. This was a woman who looked like she'd fought her way out of hell itself and barely made it. He was washing blood from a cut above her eyebrow when her eyes finally opened. They were blue, pale blue, like winter sky, and for a moment they simply stared at him without recognition or understanding. Then awareness flooded back and she tried to sit up, gasping. Easy. Silas caught her shoulders, held her down gently. You're safe. You're at Black Hollow Ranch. You're safe. She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes darted around the room, wild and searching, her breathing coming in short, panicked bursts. The others, she managed. Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and broken. The others, where are... There's no one else. Just you. Her face crumpled. Just for a second, everything inside her seemed to collapse inward, grief and horror and exhaustion all hitting at once. Then she pulled it back, visibly forced herself under control, and Silas saw something in her eyes that made him reassess every assumption he'd made in the last 5 minutes. This wasn't just a victim. This was a survivor. Raiders, she said, wagon train. They came out of the timber just after dawn. We didn't even... There were 12 of us. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. How many of them? 6, maybe 8. I couldn't... It happened so fast. And you got away. I didn't get away. Her voice went flat, dead. I hid. Under the supply wagon when it tipped. They didn't see me. They were too busy. She stopped, closed her eyes. They didn't see me. The silence stretched out between them, filled only by the crack and pop of the fire. What's your name? Silas asked finally. She opened her eyes again, looked at him properly for the first time, studying him with an intensity that felt like being weighed and measured. Elena, she said. Elena Voss. I'm Silas Mercer. This is my ranch. You're safe here, Miss Voss. I give you my word on that. Your word. A strange expression crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite something darker. I don't know you well enough to know what your word's worth, Mr. Mercer. Fair enough. Then let me prove it. Doc Morrison's on his way. He'll patch you up proper. After that, we'll talk about what comes next. What comes next is I leave, soon as I'm able. To go where? She didn't answer, probably because there wasn't an answer. A woman alone in Wyoming territory with no money, no supplies, and winter settling in hard, her options ranged from bad to worse to fatal. Miss Voss, Silas said carefully, I'm not in the habit of turning people out into the snow, especially people who've been through what you've clearly been through. Stay until you're healed. After that, we'll figure something out. I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to. Then why would you? She stopped, studying him again with those pale blue eyes. What do you want? It was the right question, the smart question, the question a woman learned to ask when men offered things that sounded too good. Nothing, Silas said, and watched her not believe him. I'm offering you shelter and medical care because you need it and I have it to give. That's the whole of it. Nobody does something for nothing. Then I'm nobody. Before she could answer, the door banged open and Tom Bridger came in with Doc Morrison, both men trailing snow and cold air. The doctor was a lean, perpetually irritated-looking man in his 60s who'd been practicing medicine in the territory since before Silas had arrived. He took one look at Elena and whistled low. This the emergency? She needs treatment, Silas said, stepping back. I can see that. Morrison moved to the sofa, already rolling up his sleeves. What happened? Raiders, Elena said before Silas could answer. Wagon train, 2 days north, near Copper Creek Canyon. Morrison's expression darkened. Copper Creek? That's rough country even when people aren't trying to kill you. He started examining her injuries with practiced efficiency. This shoulder's dislocated. I'll need to set it. It's going to hurt. Everything already hurts. Fair point. He glanced at Silas. I'll need someone to hold her down. This isn't going to be gentle. Tom stepped forward, but Silas was already there, positioning himself at Elena's head. She looked up at him, and he saw her jaw tighten. Do it, she said. Morrison didn't waste time with warnings. He just gripped her arm and pulled. The sound she made would haunt Silas for weeks afterward. Not a scream exactly, but something rawer and more fundamental, like pain given voice. Her whole body went rigid, and her hand shot out, grabbing Silas's wrist hard enough that her nails drew blood. Then it was over. Morrison was wrapping the shoulder, and Elena was breathing hard but conscious, her eyes squeezed shut. Worst part's done, Morrison said. Rest is just stitches and binding. You got lucky, girl. Another hour out there and we'd be having a very different conversation. Lucky, Elena repeated. The word sounded strange in her mouth, like she was testing it against reality and finding it wanting. Morrison worked in silence after that, stitching the gash along her ribs, binding her ankle, cleaning and wrapping the smaller cuts. Elena bore it all without making another sound, though Silas could see the pain in the rigid set of her shoulders, the white-knuckle grip she kept on the blanket. She'll need rest, Morrison said finally, packing his bag. Real rest, not just a night's sleep. Those ribs will take weeks to heal proper, and if she tries to walk on that ankle too soon, she'll do permanent damage. She stays flat on her back for at least a week, preferably 2. I'll make sure of it, Silas said. Elena's eyes snapped open. I can't stay here 2 weeks. You don't have a choice, Morrison said bluntly. You try to leave now, you'll either collapse or freeze or both. Probably both. He's right, Silas added. You stay here, in this house, until you're healed enough to make decisions that won't kill you. After that, we'll talk. He could see her wanting to argue, could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing risks, counting costs, looking for the trap she was certain had to be there. Fine, she said finally. 2 weeks, then I'm gone. 2 weeks, Silas agreed, though both of them knew it was a lie. You didn't survive what she'd survived and heal up in 14 days. But she needed to believe she had an escape route, and he needed her to stop fighting long enough to let her body start repairing itself. Morrison left with Tom, heading back out into the storm. Silas should have followed, should have gone to check on the preparations for tomorrow's cattle move. Instead, he found himself standing by the fire, watching Elena Voss slip into an exhausted sleep, and wondering what exactly he'd just let into his carefully controlled world. He'd built Black Hollow Ranch from nothing. 20 years of brutal work, of gambling everything on cattle and land, of making deals and breaking competitors, and never once letting sentiment cloud his judgment. He'd lost his wife to influenza 8 years ago and hadn't let another person get close since. Hadn't wanted to. The ranch was enough. The work was enough. But looking at the blood-stained stranger on his sofa, Silas felt something shift in his chest. Some old instinct he'd thought died with Catherine, stirring back to life. He told himself it was just compassion, just common decency. You didn't leave people to die when you had the means to save them. But standing there in the firelight, watching Elena Voss breathe, Silas Mercer had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he'd just made a decision that was going to cost him more than he could possibly imagine. And despite everything, despite his reputation and his fortune and 20 years of careful control, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through windows too clean to be real, and the smell of coffee strong enough to raise the dead. For a moment, she simply lay still, trying to place herself. The last clear memory she had was Morrison's needle pulling thread through her skin, Silas Mercer's face hovering somewhere above her, worn and serious and inexplicably kind. The room she was in now wasn't the main parlor where she'd collapsed. This was a bedroom, large and well-furnished, with a real bed under her instead of a sofa, and curtains that looked like they'd cost more than everything Elena had owned in her entire life. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her ribs screamed, her shoulder throbbed, and her ankle sent a sharp spike of pain up her leg that made her gasp. I wouldn't recommend that. Elena's head snapped toward the voice. A woman stood in the doorway, middle-aged, sturdy-looking, with graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't particularly impressed by any of it. "I'm Mary Bridger," the woman said, coming into the room with a tray. "Tom's wife. I help run the household here, such as running it needs. Mr. Mercer asked me to check on you this morning." "Where is he?" "Out moving cattle. Storm broke about 3 hours ago, and he's determined to get the herd south before the weather turns again." Mary set the tray down on a table beside the bed, coffee, bread, what looked like eggs and bacon. "He left instructions you weren't to be moved and weren't to be allowed to leave." "He can't keep me prisoner." "No, but Doc Morrison can order you to bed rest, and I can make your life considerably more difficult if you ignore that order." Mary's expression softened slightly. "You've been through hell, Miss Voss. Let yourself heal. Pride's no good to a corpse." Elena wanted to argue, but her body had other ideas. The smell of the food was making her dizzy with hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. 2 days ago? 3? "How long was I asleep?" she asked instead. "About 14 hours. It's mid-morning now." 14 hours. Elena felt something twist in her chest. She never slept that long, never let herself be that vulnerable. "The others from the wagon train," she said. "Have there been any?" "Tom and some of the hands rode out at first light to check the site. They're not back yet." Which meant there were bodies still out there. People she'd traveled with, talked with, shared meals with, dead and frozen in the snow. Elena's hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against the blanket, forced them still. "Eat," Mary said, not unkindly. "Your body needs fuel if it's going to heal. I'll be back in an hour to change your bandages." She left before Elena could respond, pulling the door closed behind her. Elena stared at the food. Her stomach was churning, but whether from hunger or grief or delayed shock, she couldn't tell. Finally, she reached for the coffee, took a sip. It was hot and strong and exactly what she needed. She made herself eat the eggs, the bacon, half the bread. Forced it down bite by bite, even though every swallow felt like a betrayal of the people who'd never get another meal. The door opened again. Elena looked up, expecting Mary, and froze. Silas Mercer stood in the doorway, snow still melting in his dark hair, his coat dusted white across the shoulders. He looked tired, the kind of tired that went deeper than one sleepless night, but his eyes were alert and measuring. "You're awake," he said. "Apparently." He came in, stopped at the foot of the bed, kept a careful distance. "Tom got back an hour ago. They found the wagon train." Elena's chest went tight. "And?" 11 bodies. They buried them proper, marked the graves. "I'm sorry, Miss Voss." 11. She'd hoped, though she'd known better than to hope, that maybe someone else had survived, that maybe she wasn't the only one who'd made it. "Thank you," she managed, "for sending them, for..." for doing that. It was the right thing to do. Silas paused. Tom said it looked like the raiders stripped everything of value and vanished into the high country. No way to track them in this snow, and they had at least a day's head start. So they got away with it. For now. The words hung there between them, heavy with implication. Elena studied him. This wealthy rancher who'd taken in a stranger, sent men to bury her dead, and was now standing in his own house looking at her like she was a problem he was trying to solve. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Doing what?" "Helping me. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. And based on what I've seen, you don't strike me as a man who makes a habit of charity cases." Silas was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "My wife died 8 years ago," he said finally. "Influenza. Took her in less than a week. I had the best doctors, the best medicine, everything money could buy. Didn't matter. She died anyway." Elena waited. "After that, I told myself I was done. Done letting people in. Done risking that kind of pain. Built this ranch into an empire and convinced myself that was enough." He met her eyes. "But when you collapsed on my doorstep, half dead and bleeding, I had a choice. I could protect my carefully controlled world, or I could be the kind of man Catherine would have wanted me to be." "So this is about your dead wife?" "No." His voice went hard. "This is about you deserving to live through what you survived. Everything else is just the excuse I'm giving myself." Elena felt something shift in her chest, some deeply buried defense mechanism recognizing that she was looking at something rare and potentially dangerous. Honesty. Real honesty, without agenda or angle. "I can work," she said. "Once I'm healed, I'm not asking for charity. Let me earn my keep and we'll call it even." "Miss Voss?" "Elena. Elena." He said her name carefully, like he was testing its weight. "You don't need to earn anything. You're a guest here, not an employee. I'm not anyone's guest. I'm a woman with no money, no family, and nowhere else to go. That's not a guest. That's a dependent. And I won't be that." She could see him processing that, recalculating. "All right," he said finally. "When you're healed, actually healed, not just mobile, we'll talk about what work you can do around here. But not until then. Agreed?" "Agreed." He nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. "The room you're in was my wife's sewing room. No one's used it in years. It's yours now, for as long as you need it." "Why would you give me that?" "Because she would have wanted it that way." He looked back at her. "And because maybe it's time this house started feeling like a home again, instead of just a place where I keep my things." Then he was gone, and Elena was left staring at the closed door, trying to figure out if she'd just been saved, or if she'd stumbled into something far more complicated than simple rescue. The days blurred together after that, measured out in increments of healing and small discoveries about the strange world she'd landed in. Black Hollow Ranch, Elena learned, was not just wealthy, it was an empire. Silas owned thousands of acres across 3 counties, ran more cattle than she could count, employed dozens of hands year-round and twice that during branding season. The ranch house itself was something out of an Eastern magazine, all solid timber and glass windows and furniture that looked like it had been shipped from back east at considerable expense. But for all its prosperity, the place felt hollow, empty in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. Mary Bridger visited twice daily to change bandages and bring meals. She was gruff but competent, and after the 3rd day she stopped looking at Elena like she might bolt at any moment. "You settling in all right?" Mary asked one afternoon, unwrapping the binding on Elena's ribs. "As well as can be expected." "Mr. Mercer been treating you proper?" Elena glanced at her sharply. "Has he given you reason to think otherwise?" "No, but you're the first woman he's let stay in this house since Catherine died, and people talk." "Let them talk. I'll be gone soon enough anyway." "Will you?" The question hung there while Mary finished rewrapping the bandages. Elena didn't answer because she didn't have an answer. Where would she go? What would she do? The wagon train had been her last real plan, and that had ended in blood and snow. Silas himself was mostly absent during those first weeks. She'd see him at odd hours, early morning before he rode out, late evening when he returned, always covered in dust or snow or both. He'd stop by her room, ask how she was healing, exchange a few words, then disappear again. It should have been a relief, should have felt like privacy. Instead, it felt like avoidance, though whether he was avoiding her or something about her presence that made him uncomfortable, she couldn't tell. By the end of the second week, Elena was mobile enough to move around the room. Her ribs still ached and her ankle protested any prolonged standing, but she could walk, could function. She started exploring. The ranch house was bigger than she'd realized, full of rooms that nobody seemed to use. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20. A library lined with books that showed no signs of being read. Bedrooms upstairs, she counted 6, all perfectly maintained and completely empty. It was in one of those upstairs rooms that she found the portrait. A woman's face captured in oils with the kind of skill that suggested the artist had been expensive. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, and a slight smile that looked like it held secrets. "That's Catherine." Elena spun, nearly lost her balance. Silas stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm sorry," Elena said. "I didn't mean to. I was just looking around and it's fine. You're not trespassing." He came into the room, stopped beside her, looked up at the portrait. She sat for that painting the year before she died, hated every minute of it, said it made her feel like livestock being catalogued. She was beautiful. She was brilliant. The beauty was just what people noticed first. His voice was matter-of-fact, without the heavy grief Elena had expected. "She ran this ranch better than I did, truth be told. Had a head for numbers and people in equal measure. When she died, I kept things running out of spite more than anything else. Couldn't let it fall apart. She would have been disappointed." Elena looked at him, this man who'd built an empire and then lost the person who made it mean something. "You must have loved her very much." "I did. Still do, in the way you love people who aren't here to love back." He turned away from the portrait. "But life doesn't stop just because you want it to. Eventually, you either keep moving or you let it bury you." "Which one did you choose?" "I'm still deciding." They stood there in the empty room, surrounded by furniture covered in dust sheets and silence that felt like a held breath. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, "for not asking about what happened, about the wagon train. You'll talk about it when you're ready, or you won't. Either way, it's not my business." Most people would ask. Most people mistake curiosity for compassion. He looked at her directly, and she felt the weight of that gaze, careful and assessing without being invasive. "I don't need to know your story to know you deserve better than what you got." Something in Elena's chest cracked, just a hairline fracture in the armor she'd been maintaining, but enough to let something warm and dangerous seep through. "I should get back downstairs," she said, suddenly needing distance. "Mary said I'm not supposed to be climbing stairs yet." "Then let me help you." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena took it. They descended slowly, her weight supported more by his strength than her own failing ankle, and by the time they reached the bottom, she was breathless, and her ribs were screaming. Silas settled her back in her room, made sure she had water and blankets, then headed for the door. "Silas?" The name came out before she could stop it, the first time she'd called him anything but Mr. Mercer. He turned. "Why did you really let me stay?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because the alternative was letting you die, and I've already lost too many people to choices I couldn't control. This was one I could." He left before she could respond, and Elena sat in the fading afternoon light, trying to understand the strange alchemy happening in this hollow house on the edge of the Wyoming wilderness. By the end of the third week, Elena was healed enough to insist on working. Mary tried to talk her out of it. "You're still mending. Another week in bed wouldn't hurt." "Another week in bed will drive me insane," Elena countered. "I need to be useful." "Why? Mr. Mercer's not charging you rent." "That's exactly why." She started small, mending torn work shirts for the ranch hands, organizing the cluttered supply room off the kitchen, darning socks that Mary admitted she'd been putting off for months. The work felt good, felt normal, felt like she was earning the space she occupied instead of just accepting charity. The hands noticed, started bringing her their worst repairs, the ones that would have required a trip to town otherwise. She fixed them all, sitting in a chair by the kitchen window where the light was good, her fingers working needle and thread with the muscle memory of too many years doing exactly this kind of work. Silas noticed too. "You don't have to do that," he said one evening, finding her hunched over a particularly vicious tear in what looked like expensive leather. "It needs doing." "I can pay someone in town." "You're already paying me in room and board. This is the least I can do." He pulled up a chair, sat down across from her. "Elena, you're still recovering. You don't need to." Yes, I do. She looked up from her work, met his eyes. I need to do this. I need to feel like I'm contributing something instead of just existing here like a ghost someone forgot to bury. She watched him process that, saw understanding dawn in his expression. All right, he said finally, but the moment you feel pain, you stop. Agreed? Agreed. He didn't leave, just sat there watching her work, and the silence between them felt comfortable in a way that should have been unsettling but somehow wasn't. You're good at that, he said after a while. I've had practice. My mother was a seamstress. Died when I was 12, but she taught me everything she knew first. Elena pulled another stitch tight. It's one of the few useful skills I managed to acquire. Where's your father? Dead. Died when I was 17. After that, it was just me. Is that why you joined the wagon train? Elena's hand stilled. I joined the wagon train because there was nothing left for me back east. No family, no prospects, no future except slow starvation or worse. Figured I'd take my chances heading west. See if I could make something of myself where nobody knew me. And instead, you nearly died in the snow. Instead, I ended up here. She pulled the last stitch through, bit off the thread, held up the repaired shirt. Which is either the best luck I've ever had or the worst, and I'm still figuring out which. I hope it's the former. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the wealth and authority to the lonely man underneath. Me too. Winter settled in hard after that. The snow piled up in drifts that buried fences and made the ranch feel like an island cut off from the rest of the world. The hands hunkered down in the bunkhouse, coming out only for essential work, feeding cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, checking for wolves. Elena found herself spending more time in the main house. It wasn't intentional, exactly. It just happened. She'd finish her mending, and Mary would need help in the kitchen, or Silas would ask her opinion on supply orders, or one of the hands would need new gloves made up because his old ones had worn through. Slowly, without anyone quite noticing, the hollow house started feeling less hollow. One night, about 6 weeks after her arrival, Elena was sitting by the fire darning socks when Silas came in from checking the stock. He looked exhausted, his face wind-burned and his hands red from cold. Coffee's hot, Elena said, not looking up from her work, and Mary left stew on the stove. You sound like you live here. I do live here. For now, anyway. He poured coffee, sank into the chair across from her with a grateful sigh. How are the ribs? Better. I can breathe without feeling like I'm being stabbed. That's progress. They fell into comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves, throwing snow against the windows in angry bursts. Elena, Silas said after a while. When you're fully healed, when spring comes, what are you planning to do? She'd known the question was coming. Had been avoiding thinking about it because thinking about it meant confronting the fact that she had no answer. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose I could try to find work in town, maybe as a seamstress or a cook. Or you could stay here. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Elena's hands stopped moving. Stay here as permanent staff. Mary could use help managing the household, and the hands clearly appreciate having someone who can actually repair their gear instead of just patching it badly. He was looking at the fire, not at her, his voice carefully neutral. It would be a fair wage, room and board included. Nothing charity about it. Silas, I'm not asking you to decide now, just think about it. That's all I'm asking. She should say no. Should thank him politely and explain that staying would be complicated, that people would talk, that there were too many ways it could go wrong. But what came out instead was, I'll think about it. He nodded, still not looking at her, and Elena went back to her darning with fingers that trembled just slightly. Outside, the storm raged on, and inside Black Hollow Ranch, two people who'd both lost everything sat by the fire, not quite ready to admit they'd found something neither had been looking for. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, reluctant and uncertain, like it wasn't quite sure it was welcome. The snow melted in fits and starts, leaving the ranch grounds a mess of mud and slush that made every chore twice as hard. But the ice broke on the water troughs, the cattle started calving, and Elena Voss discovered that staying at Black Hollow Ranch as permanent staff was considerably more complicated than she'd imagined. The problem wasn't the work. She'd taken over most of the household management from Mary Bridger, who'd admitted with obvious relief that she preferred working with the livestock to managing linens and supply orders. Elena organized the chaos that had accumulated in 8 years of bachelor living, sorted through storage rooms that hadn't been touched since Catherine Mercer died, established systems for tracking expenses, and turned the ranch house from a place where Silas occasionally slept into something that actually functioned like a home. The problem was everyone else. It started small. A ranch hand named Cooper making comments just loud enough to be heard about how convenient it must be, living in the big house instead of the bunkhouse. Mary's sister visiting from town and asking pointed questions about sleeping arrangements. Tom Bridger pulling Silas aside one evening for a conversation that Elena couldn't hear, but could definitely interpret from the way both men's voices rose and fell in tense rhythms. Elena tried to ignore it, kept her head down, did her work, and told herself that people would get used to the arrangement eventually. Then Samuel Wickham came to call. Wickham owned the second largest ranch in the territory, a spread called Twin Pines that bordered Black Hollow's southern pastures. He was a florid-faced man in his 50s with political ambitions and the kind of self-importance that came from inheriting wealth rather than earning it. He and Silas had what could charitably be called a business relationship. They cooperated when absolutely necessary and competed over everything else. Elena was in the kitchen working on the week's supply inventory when she heard voices in the parlor. Silas's low rumble and another voice, higher pitched, and carrying the particular accent of someone who'd been educated back east and wanted everyone to know it. "I'm just saying, Mercer, people are talking." That was Wickham. You can't blame them. A wealthy bachelor, a mysterious woman, no chaperone to speak of. "Miss Voss is my employee." Silas's voice had gone cold. "Her living arrangements are no one's concern but our own. Come now. You know how it looks. I know how small minds make it look." Elena set down her pen, listening despite herself. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Wickham continued. "I'm trying to give you friendly advice. You're a respected man in this territory. You have influence, but influence is fragile, Silas. One wrong move, one scandal. There's no scandal. There's an employee living in quarters appropriate to her position. In the main house, in rooms that used to belong to your wife." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. "Get out," Silas said quietly. "I'm only trying to get out." Elena heard footsteps, the front door opening and slamming shut, then silence. She waited, knowing she should go back to her work, knowing she should pretend she hadn't heard any of it. Instead, she found herself walking to the parlor. Silas stood by the window, his back to the door, shoulders rigid with controlled anger. He didn't turn when she entered. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." "Then you know what people are saying." "I've known for weeks. I was just hoping it would die down on its own." Elena moved into the room, kept her distance. "If my being here is causing problems for you, the problem isn't you, it's people like Wickham who can't imagine a man and woman occupying the same space without there being something improper about it. But he's right about one thing. Perception matters, especially out here." Now Silas did turn, and the look on his face was something between frustration and exhaustion. "So what would you have me do? Fire you to satisfy gossips? Send you back out into the world with a reference letter and a pat on the back?" "I don't know. But I also don't want to be the reason you lose standing in the community." "I don't give a damn about standing." "Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it." Elena crossed her arms. "This ranch didn't build itself. You've spent 20 years earning respect and accumulating influence. That matters, Silas. Whether you like it or not, it matters." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through the angles, calculating costs and consequences the way he probably calculated everything. "All right," he said finally. "Let's say you're right. Let's say perception matters and my reputation is at stake. What's your solution?" "I could move to town, work here during the day, live somewhere else at night." "In what? There's no suitable housing in town for a single woman, and anything unsuitable would just feed different rumors." "Then I could—" "No." His voice was flat, final. "You're not leaving this ranch because Samuel Wickham and people like him can't mind their own business. I won't let their small-mindedness dictate how I run my household." "Then what do we do?" Silas rubbed his face, suddenly looking every year of his age. "We keep going. We do the work, maintain propriety where it matters, and let the rest sort itself out. Eventually they'll find something else to gossip about." Elena wanted to believe him, but she'd seen how these things worked, back east and out here. Reputation was currency, and once spent, it was almost impossible to earn back. "Silas," she said carefully, "what if it doesn't sort itself out? What if this gets worse instead of better?" "Then we'll deal with it when it does." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was all he had to give, and she could see in his eyes that he knew it wasn't enough. She went back to the kitchen, finished her inventory, made dinner for two people who ate in near silence, both of them thinking about the conversation they just had and the problem that refused to be solved. After that, Elena started noticing things she'd been too busy to see before. The way ranch hands would stop talking when she walked by. The careful distance Tom Bridger maintained whenever he had to interact with her. Mary's increasingly strained attempts to pretend everything was normal. She was becoming a liability. Not through anything she'd done, but simply through existing in a place where her existence raised questions people wanted answered. 2 weeks after Wickham's visit, Elena was hanging laundry in the yard when a carriage pulled up. Expensive, well-maintained, driven by a man in livery that suggested serious money. A woman stepped out, middle-aged and expensively dressed, with the kind of face that had probably been beautiful once and was now just severe. "You must be Miss Voss," the woman said, approaching with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am. Can I help you?" "I'm Constance Hartford. My husband owns Hartford Mining. We're neighbors of sorts, though our property is 15 miles east." She looked Elena up and down with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating livestock. "I've heard a great deal about you." "Have you?" "Oh, yes. The mysterious woman living with Silas Mercer. Everyone's quite curious." Elena set down her laundry basket. "I work for Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Hartford. There's nothing mysterious about it." "Of course not. I'm sure it's all very proper." The words were pleasant, but the tone wasn't. "I actually came to extend an invitation. We're hosting a gathering next month. All the prominent families in the territory will be attending. I thought it might be nice for you to meet people, establish yourself in the community." It was a trap. Had to be. Women like Constance Hartford didn't extend friendly invitations to household staff. "That's very kind," Elena said carefully, "but I'm not sure it would be appropriate." "Nonsense. You're living at one of the most important ranches in Wyoming. Of course you should attend." Constance's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Besides, I've already extended the invitation to Mr. Mercer. It would be awkward if his employee didn't accompany him." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't kindness. This was something else entirely. A test, maybe. Or an opportunity to put her on display, let the territory's elite examine her like a specimen and draw their own conclusions. "I'll discuss it with Mr. Mercer," Elena said. "Do that. I look forward to seeing you both." Constance climbed back into her carriage, and Elena watched it roll away, wondering what exactly she'd just agreed to. She found Silas in the barn that evening, checking a mare that was due to foal. He looked up when she entered, registered her expression, and straightened. "What happened?" Elena told him about Constance Hartford's visit, about the invitation, about the feeling that she was being set up for something she didn't fully understand. Silas's jaw tightened. "She's testing us." "Testing what?" "Whether we'll show up, whether we'll play their game. The Hartfords have been trying to establish themselves as territory society for years, Constance particularly. This is her way of forcing us into a position where we either attend and submit to scrutiny or refuse and confirm every rumor about impropriety. So we don't go. If we don't go, it looks like we're hiding, like we have something to be ashamed of. And if we do go, then we walk into a room full of people who've already decided what they think about us, and we try not to give them more ammunition." He leaned against the stall door. "There's no good option here, Elena." "Then let me make it easier. I won't go. You attend, represent the ranch, and I stay here where I don't cause you problems." "That's not happening. Silas, if I go without you, it confirms that I'm ashamed of having you here, that I know people are right to question the arrangement. I won't do that to you." "So we're trapped. We're backed into a corner. It's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We go together. We conduct ourselves with complete propriety. We make it clear through our behavior that there's nothing improper happening, and we dare anyone to suggest otherwise. You make it sound simple. It won't be. But it's the only play we have that doesn't involve one of us sacrificing the other." Elena looked at him, this stubborn, complicated man who'd saved her life and then refused to let the world punish her for being saved. "You realize this could backfire, could make everything worse." "It could." But doing nothing definitely will make it worse. At least this way we're taking action instead of just waiting for the hammer to fall. She wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this could go wrong. But she also knew he was right. They couldn't hide forever, and passivity would just feed the rumors. All right, she said. We go, together, and we show them there's nothing to gossip about. Exactly. Neither of them mentioned that showing people there was nothing to gossip about didn't make it true. That standing beside him at a society gathering would look exactly like the thing they were claiming it wasn't. That every moment of propriety they performed would be examined for cracks. But sometimes you didn't have good choices. You just had less bad ones, and you made them anyway. The month leading up to the Hartford gathering was tense in ways Elena couldn't quite articulate. Silas threw himself into ranch work with single-minded intensity, as if he could solve problems with cattle and land that he couldn't solve with people. Elena maintained her household duties with meticulous precision, making sure every detail of her work was above reproach. They were careful around each other, too careful. Maintaining distance that hadn't been there before, conscious of how every interaction might be perceived by watching eyes. Mary noticed. You two are being ridiculous, she said one afternoon, finding Elena in the laundry room folding sheets with aggressive precision. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. You're tiptoeing around each other like strangers when 2 months ago you were having dinner together every night and actually talking like human beings. That was before people started talking. People are always going to talk, Elena. That's what people do. The question is whether you're going to let them dictate how you live. Elena set down the sheet she was folding. It's not that simple. It never is. But making yourself miserable to appease gossips isn't going to make them stop gossiping. It's just going to make you miserable. I don't want to cause problems for Silas. You think you're causing problems? You should have seen this place before you arrived. A man living alone in a house too big for him, working himself into the ground because he didn't have anything else. You gave him something to care about besides cattle and profit margins. That's not a problem. That's the opposite of a problem. Mary, I know it's complicated. I know people are watching, but don't let them take away the good thing you've built here just because they can't understand it. Mary's expression softened. You're good for him, Elena, and whether you'll admit it or not, he's good for you too. Elena wanted to deny it, wanted to maintain the careful fiction that this was just employment, just circumstance, just two people occupying the same space without it meaning anything deeper. But the truth was harder and more dangerous than that. The truth was that somewhere between surviving and healing and learning to live again, she'd started caring about Silas Mercer in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the man himself. And that was a problem she had no idea how to solve. 3 days before the Hartford gathering, a merchant named Davis rode out from town with fabric samples. Elena had mentioned to Silas that she needed a proper dress for the event. Everything she owned was either work clothes or the tattered remains of what she'd arrived in. He'd sent word to Davis, who'd brought enough fabric to outfit a small army. Mr. Mercer was very specific about quality, Davis said, spreading out bolts of silk and wool across the kitchen table. Said you were to have whatever you wanted. Price, no object. Elena stared at the display, overwhelmed. This is too much. That's what I told him. He said he didn't care. Of course he did. Because Silas Mercer didn't do anything by half measures, including making sure his household manager was properly dressed for a society gathering that was really just an excuse to judge them both. Elena chose a deep blue wool, practical, elegant, suitable for someone in her position without being ostentatious. She worked on the dress herself, late at night after the day's work was done, her fingers remembering skills her mother had taught her 15 years ago. The night before the gathering, she tried it on in her room, studying herself in the mirror. The dress fit well. She'd always been good with measurements, and the color brought out her eyes. But looking at her reflection, Elena saw what everyone at the Hartford estate would see. A woman trying to be something she wasn't. A servant pretending to belong in spaces meant for her betters. She was still standing there, fighting back unexpected tears, when someone knocked on her door. Elena? Silas's voice. Can I come in? She wiped her eyes quickly. Yes. He opened the door, stopped when he saw her. For a moment he just stared, and Elena felt heat rise in her face. You made that yourself? He asked finally. I did. Is it appropriate? I wasn't sure about the... It's perfect. He said it quietly, with a certainty that made her chest tight. You look beautiful. Elena didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know how to respond to the way he was looking at her, like she was something precious instead of just convenient. I'm scared, she admitted. About tomorrow. About facing all those people who've already decided what they think of me. I know, I am too. You're Silas Mercer. You're not scared of anything. That's what I let people think. Doesn't make it true. He moved further into the room, stopped a careful distance away. I need to tell you something, before tomorrow, before we walk into that gathering and let them judge us. Elena's heart kicked hard against her ribs. All right. When you first arrived here, I told myself I was helping you out of basic decency, that it was the right thing to do and nothing more complicated than that. He was choosing his words carefully, like each one cost him something, but that was a lie. Or maybe it started as truth and became a lie somewhere along the way. I don't know. Silas, let me finish, please. He took a breath. Having you here, watching you bring life back into this house, talking to you every evening about nothing and everything, it made me realize how lonely I've been, how much I've been just existing instead of living. And now people are talking, and rumors are spreading, and tomorrow we're going to face a room full of judgment, and I need you to know something before we do. Elena waited, afraid to breathe. I need you to know that no matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what they say or think or imply, I don't regret any of it. Not bringing you into this house, not giving you work, not spending every evening looking forward to seeing you. If standing beside you tomorrow costs me every ounce of respect I've accumulated in 20 years, it'll be worth it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. You're a fool, Elena said finally, her voice shaking. Probably. You should protect yourself. Protect the ranch. Not stake everything on... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't name what this was becoming. On what? On you? Silas moved closer, and Elena's breath caught. Maybe I should. Maybe that would be smart, but I stopped being smart the day I let you stay. I'm not going to start now. He was close enough to touch. Close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes, the vulnerability in an expression usually so carefully controlled. Elena knew she should step back, should maintain the distance they'd been so carefully preserving, should not do what every instinct was screaming at her to do. She kissed him. It was brief, barely more than a brush of lips, and she pulled back immediately, terrified and exhilarated and convinced she'd just ruined everything. I'm sorry, she started. I shouldn't have... Silas kissed her back. This time, it wasn't brief. This time it was the kind of kiss that meant things, that changed things, that crossed lines they both knew existed and did it anyway. His hands came up to frame her face, and she gripped his shirt, and for a moment everything else, the ranch, the rumors, tomorrow's gathering, disappeared into irrelevance. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Well, Silas said, that's going to make tomorrow more complicated. Elena laughed, shaky and slightly hysterical. We're idiots. Unquestionably. This doesn't solve anything. It probably makes everything worse. I know. People are going to talk even more than they already are. Let them. She looked at him, this man who'd saved her, employed her, protected her, and was now looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd stopped asking years ago. What are we doing? She whispered. I don't know, but I'm done pretending I don't want to find out. They stood there in her room, the dress she'd made hanging forgotten in the corner, and Elena felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental recalibration of what was possible, what was worth fighting for, what she was willing to risk. Tomorrow's going to be a disaster, she said. Probably. They're going to tear us apart. They'll try. And if we walk in there together, if we show them that there's something between us, then we show them. Silas's voice was firm. And we dare them to make something of it. Elena thought about the wagon train, about the raiders and the blood and crawling out of the snow more dead than alive, about all the times she'd survived when she should have died, all the choices she'd made that had led her to this moment, this man, this strange and terrifying possibility. All right, she said, we show them. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of spring day that promised warmth it had no intention of delivering. Elena dressed carefully, her fingers steady on the buttons despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. The blue dress looked even better in natural light, and she'd done her hair in a style her mother had favored. Simple but elegant, nothing too ambitious. When she came downstairs, Silas was waiting in the parlor. He dressed for the occasion too, in a dark suit that made him look like what he was, a wealthy rancher with the bearing of someone who'd earned every acre he owned. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but I don't think waiting will make me readier." They took the carriage. Silas drove, refusing Tom's offer to handle the horses, and Elena sat beside him, trying not to think about how this must look to anyone who happened to see them passing. A wealthy ranch owner and his household manager, riding together to a society gathering like equals. The Hartford estate sprawled across a hilltop 15 miles east of Black Hollow, all manicured grounds and imported trees that looked faintly ridiculous in the Wyoming landscape. The main house was newer than Silas's, built with mining money and designed to impress rather than endure. Carriages lined the drive, and Elena counted at least 30 people milling about the grounds when they arrived. All of them dressed in their finest, all of them turning to look as Silas helped her down from the carriage. The whispers started immediately. Constance Hartford appeared like she'd been waiting, her smile sharp and welcoming and completely insincere. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Voss, how delightful that you could attend." "Mrs. Hartford," Silas nodded. "Thank you for the invitation." Of course, of course. Come, you must meet everyone, though I suspect many people have been quite eager to meet Miss Voss." She said it pleasantly, but Elena heard the knife underneath. This wasn't a social gathering. This was an examination, and she was the specimen. Constance led them through the crowd, making introductions with the practiced ease of someone who'd been hosting gatherings her entire life. The Wickhams were there, Samuel looking smug, and his wife Frances regarding Elena with cold curiosity. The Kensington family from the timber operation, the Reeves from the mercantile empire, the Daltons, the Shepherds, the Montgomerys, all the prominent families who'd built fortunes in Wyoming territory and now spent their time maintaining their positions in the social hierarchy. Every introduction felt like a test. Every handshake came with appraising eyes. Every polite question. "How are you finding Wyoming, Miss Voss?" "How long have you been at Black Hollow?" "What brings a young woman so far from civilization?" carried implications that had nothing to do with the actual words. Elena answered with careful politeness, maintaining the fiction that she was simply household staff attending at her employer's request. But she could feel the weight of judgment, the calculations happening behind every pleasant smile. It was Frances Wickham who finally brought the subtext to the surface. They were standing near the refreshment table when Frances approached, wine glass in hand and malice in her eyes. "Miss Voss, I've been meaning to ask, how exactly did you come to be at Black Hollow Ranch? The circumstances sound so dramatic." "I survived a wagon train attack," Elena said evenly. "Mr. Mercer was kind enough to offer shelter." "Yes, but that was months ago, wasn't it? And yet you're still there, living in the main house, I understand, in quarters that used to belong to Mrs. Mercer." The group around them had gone quiet, everyone pretending not to listen while listening intently. "I work for Mr. Mercer," Elena said. "My living quarters are appropriate to my position." "Of course. Though one does wonder about the propriety of the arrangement. A young woman, a wealthy widower, no chaperone to speak of." Frances's smile was poisonous. "But I suppose standards are different out here in the territories." Elena felt her face flush, felt the trap closing around her. Anything she said now would either sound defensive or confirm the implications. It was Silas who stepped in, his voice cutting across the tension with surgical precision. "Mrs. Wickham, do you have something to say about my household management? I suggest you say it directly instead of hiding behind insinuation." Frances blinked, clearly not expecting to be confronted. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You're suggesting something improper is occurring under my roof. So either make the accusation clearly, or stop wasting everyone's time with gossip dressed up as concern." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone was staring now, no pretense of polite disinterest. Frances's face had gone red. "I was simply observing. You were simply trying to cause trouble." Silas's voice was cold enough to frost glass. "Miss Voss survived an attack that killed 11 people. She came to my door more dead than alive, and I offered her shelter because that's what decent people do. She's since proven herself invaluable to the running of my household, and her living arrangements are no more anyone's business than the color of my curtains or the breed of my horses." "Silas, really? I'm not finished. Miss Voss has conducted herself with complete propriety from the moment she arrived. She's earned her position through hard work and dedication. If that makes her the subject of gossip among people who have nothing better to do than speculate about other people's lives, that says considerably more about the gossips than it does about her." He was defending her, in front of everyone, making himself the target alongside her. Elena wanted to stop him, to tell him he didn't need to do this, that she could handle Francis Wickham's implications. But she also knew he needed to say it, needed to make it clear that he stood with her, not apart from her. Francis had recovered some of her composure. I see. And I suppose we're all just meant to accept this arrangement without question? You're meant to mind your own business. But since that seems beyond you, yes, accept it. Miss Voss is under my protection, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me, directly, instead of hiding behind social niceties. Frances opened her mouth, closed it again, looked around for support and found only uncomfortable faces. Even Samuel Wickham looked uneasy, clearly not wanting to be dragged into a public confrontation. I think perhaps we should get some air, Frances said finally, and fled. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations resuming in careful bursts. Elena stood frozen, processing what had just happened, while Silas remained beside her, his jaw tight with controlled anger. You didn't have to do that, Elena said quietly. Yes, I did. You just made an enemy of everyone in this room. Good. Better they know where I stand. He was right, and he was wrong. And Elena felt her heart breaking for both of them. Because standing up to Francis Wickham might have felt satisfying in the moment, but it had just confirmed every rumor swirling around them, had made their relationship, whatever it was, public fodder in the most dramatic way possible. They left the gathering half an hour later, neither of them able to stomach the carefully polite conversations that resumed after the confrontation. The ride back to Black Hollow was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were back at the ranch, standing in the familiar parlor, that Silas finally spoke. I'm sorry, he said. I lost my temper. I should have handled that better. You defended me. I made things worse. Maybe. Or maybe you just dragged everything into the open instead of letting it fester. Elena sank into a chair. Either way, we can't pretend anymore. Everyone knows now that there's something between us, even if they don't know exactly what. And what is there between us? Silas asked. Because after last night, after today, I think we need to be honest about it. Elena looked at him, this complicated man who'd saved her life and given her purpose, and was now willing to risk everything he'd built for her sake. I don't know, she admitted. I know I care about you. I know I don't want to leave. I know that the thought of you being hurt because of me makes me want to scream. She paused. But I also don't know if what we have is enough to withstand what's coming. Because after today, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Then we make it enough, Silas said simply. We stand together, and we make it through. You make it sound easy. It won't be, but nothing worth having ever is. He was right, Elena knew, and wrong, and standing at a crossroads that had no clear path forward. But as the afternoon light faded and the ranch settled into evening quiet, she made a choice. The same choice she'd made in the snow months ago, when she'd refused to let the cold take her. The choice to keep fighting, keep surviving, keep pushing forward even when the odds were terrible. She stood, crossed to where Silas waited, and took his hand. All right, she said, we stand together, and we see what happens next. It wasn't a solution, wasn't a guarantee, but it was a commitment, and for now, that was enough. The backlash came faster than either of them expected. 2 days after the Hartford gathering, Tom Bridger found Silas in the north pasture checking fence lines and delivered news that made Elena's public defense look like the opening shot in a war neither of them had wanted to fight. 3 suppliers in town won't extend credit anymore, Tom said, his weathered face grim. Said their wives heard about the situation at Black Hollow and won't have their businesses associated with impropriety. Silas straightened from examining a rotted post, his jaw tight. Which suppliers? Morrison's feed store, the tack shop, and Callahan's General Goods. That's most of what we need for spring operations. Tom shifted his weight. There's more. Wickham's been spreading word that anyone who does business with Black Hollow is supporting immoral conduct. He's calling in favors, applying pressure. Of course he is. Silas pulled off his work gloves, slapped them against his thigh. He's been looking for an opening to undermine me for years. This just gave him the excuse. It's working, Silas. People are listening. The gathering at Hartford's made everything worse, made it public. Tom hesitated. There's talk in town about bringing it before the Territorial Council. Formal complaints about moral standards, influence on the community, that kind of thing. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. The Territorial Council had limited actual power, but they could make life difficult, could apply social pressure that translated into economic consequences, could turn whispers and rumors into something with teeth. "Let me guess," he said. "Wickham's leading that effort too." Him and Hartford. They're making it sound like they're protecting community values, like they're concerned citizens instead of opportunists looking to damage a competitor. And Elena? Tom's expression softened slightly. She's become the symbol of everything they think is wrong here. A strange woman, living in sin with a wealthy rancher, corrupting moral standards. It doesn't matter that none of it's true. The story's better than the truth. Silas walked to his horse, pulled himself into the saddle with movements that felt heavier than they should. "I'm going to town. See if I can talk sense into these people before this gets worse. You think talking will help?" "Probably not, but I have to try." He rode into town that afternoon, and what he found confirmed his worst fears. The usual friendly greetings were gone, replaced by averted eyes and sudden conversations that stopped when he approached. Morrison refused to see him entirely. The tech shop owner at least had the decency to explain face-to-face that his wife had given him an ultimatum: Black Hollow's business or his marriage. He'd chosen his marriage. Silas couldn't even blame him. It was at Callahan's general store that things turned ugly. He walked in to find Samuel Wickham already there, holding court with half a dozen other men. The conversation died when Silas entered. "Mercer," Wickham said, his tone carefully neutral. "Surprised to see you in town." "I do business here, same as always." "Do you? I wonder if that's still true." Wickham set down the catalog he'd been examining. "I've been hearing troubling things, Silas, about the situation at your ranch." "The situation is that I employ a woman to manage my household. That's the whole of it." "Is it? Because from what I hear, it's considerably more than that. A young woman living under your roof, no proper chaperone, you defending her honor at social gatherings like she's something more than staff." "Careful, Samuel. I'm just stating facts. Facts that are making people uncomfortable, making them question whether Black Hollow Ranch represents the kind of values we want influencing this territory." The other men were watching now, measuring. Silas recognized most of them: business owners, small ranchers, men he'd worked with for years. Men who were now looking at him like he'd become something foreign and possibly dangerous. "My values," Silas said slowly, "involve not leaving people to die in the snow, involve treating employees with dignity, involve not sacrificing someone's reputation to protect my own. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not mine. It becomes everyone's problem when it affects the community." Wickham's voice had taken on a righteous tone that set Silas's teeth on edge. "We have standards here, expectations about how people conduct themselves. You can't just ignore those because you've decided some stranger is worth protecting. Elena Voss isn't a stranger. She's a member of my household, and I won't stand here and let you drag her name through the mud to serve your own ambitions." "My ambitions?" Wickham's face reddened. "This isn't about ambition. This is about maintaining decency in a place that's already rough enough without wealthy men deciding the rules don't apply to them." "The rules you're talking about are gossip and innuendo, not actual standards." "Are they? Then why won't you do the decent thing? Send the woman away, restore your reputation, show the community you understand proper behavior?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the store was watching now, waiting to see how Silas would respond. "Because," Silas said carefully, "doing the decent thing means standing by people when it costs you something, not just when it's convenient." Wickham's smile was sharp and satisfied, like he'd just gotten the answer he wanted. "Then I suppose we all know where you stand, and we can act accordingly." It wasn't a threat exactly, but it was close enough. Silas left without buying anything, knowing the purchase wouldn't be honored anyway. He rode back to Black Hollow feeling the weight of consequences settling onto his shoulders like physical pressure. This was worse than he'd anticipated. Wickham and his allies weren't just spreading rumors, they were organizing, turning social pressure into economic warfare and using Elena as the weapon. He found her in the kitchen when he returned, working on accounts with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She looked up when he entered, saw his expression, and set down her pen. "That bad?" she asked. "Worse." He told her everything: the suppliers cutting off credit, the Territorial Council threats, Wickham's barely veiled implications that standing by her meant standing against the community. Elena listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This is my fault," she said finally. "No, it's their fault for making it into something it isn't." "Silas, be realistic. You're losing business relationships you've spent 20 years building. People are questioning your judgment, your values, your standing in the community, all because I'm here, all because they're small-minded and looking for someone to punish." "Maybe, but the result is the same." She stood, wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold something in. "I should leave, go to another territory, another town, somewhere the rumors won't follow." "And go where? Do what? You have no money, no connections, nothing but the clothes on your back and the skills you've built here." "I'll figure something out. I always do." "Elena, you're going to lose everything." Her voice cracked. "The ranch, your reputation, your standing, everything you've worked for. And for what? For me? That's not fair. That's not right." Silas crossed the kitchen, caught her shoulders, made her look at him. "Listen to me. I've spent 20 years building an empire that meant nothing because I had no one to share it with. I've been wealthy and lonely and convinced myself that was enough. And then you walked into my life and reminded me that some things matter more than reputation or standing or what other people think. That's easy to say now. Wait until you've lost it all and see if you still feel that way." "I'll feel the same way, because losing you would cost me more than losing the ranch ever could." She stared at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You don't know that. You can't know that." "Yes, I can, because I already lost everything once when Catherine died, and I survived it by shutting down, by making myself care about nothing but work and profit. I won't do that again. I won't sacrifice you to protect assets and reputation." "Then what do we do? Because walking away means I lose you, and staying means you lose everything else." It was the central problem, and Silas didn't have a solution. Just the stubborn conviction that there had to be another way, some path through this that didn't require either of them to sacrifice everything. "We fight," he said. "We show them they can't intimidate us into submission. We prove that Black Hollow Ranch is stronger than their gossip and pressure." "How? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out." Elena wanted to believe him. He could see it in her face, the desperate hope fighting against practical despair. But he could also see the doubt, the understanding that sometimes wanting something wasn't enough to make it possible. That night, unable to sleep, Silas found himself in his study going through accounts and trying to calculate how long they could survive if the economic pressure continued. The numbers weren't encouraging. Black Hollow was profitable, but it depended on credit lines and business relationships that were rapidly evaporating. Cut off from suppliers, facing organized opposition from other ranchers, dealing with a territorial council that might impose sanctions. They had maybe 6 months before things became critical. He was still working when Elena appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Too much to think about." She came in, looked at the ledgers spread across his desk. "How bad is it really?" "Bad enough. Not fatal yet, but heading that direction if we can't stop the bleeding." "Then we need to change the narrative. Make people see that what Wickham and Hartford are saying isn't true." "How?" "We've tried explaining. We've tried defending. Nothing works." Elena was quiet, thinking. What if we stop defending and start attacking? Meaning what? Meaning we go public with what this really is. Not a scandal, not an improper arrangement, something else entirely. She met his eyes. "What if I weren't your employee anymore?" Silas felt his pulse kick. "Elena, hear me out. The problem is that I'm living here as staff, which makes it look improper. But if I weren't staff, if I were here in a different capacity, what capacity? As my ward, that would look even worse. Not as your ward." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "As your wife." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Silas stared at her, trying to process what she'd just suggested. "You're talking about marriage. I'm talking about solving the problem. Married, we're a legitimate household. The gossip loses its teeth because there's nothing improper about a man and his wife living under the same roof. That's not a reason to get married, isn't it? People marry for worse reasons, for property, for money, for social advantage. At least we actually care about each other." She was right, and she was wrong, and Silas felt something twist in his chest. "I won't let you marry me just to solve a business problem." "It's not just business, it's survival, yours and mine." Elena stepped closer. You said you wouldn't sacrifice me to protect your assets. Well, I won't stand by and watch you lose everything because you're too stubborn to see a solution. A marriage of convenience isn't a solution. It's a different kind of prison. Who said anything about convenience? I care about you, Silas. I think I might even love you, though we haven't had time to figure that out properly. So yes, there's an element of strategy here, but that doesn't make it fake. Silas looked at her, this fierce, complicated woman who'd survived hell and learned to thrive anyway, who was now offering to tie her life to his, partly to save him, and partly because she actually wanted to. If we do this, he said slowly, it has to be real. Not a performance for the community, not a business arrangement. Real. I know. And if it doesn't work, if we can't make this work, then we'll deal with that when we come to it. But right now, this is the best option we have. Better than you losing the ranch. Better than me running away. Better than letting Wickham and people like him win. She was right. Silas knew she was right. But the idea of marrying Elena under these circumstances, rushed and strategic and driven by external pressure instead of organic feeling, felt wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. I need to think about this, he said. We don't have much time. The longer this drags out, the more damage they can do. I know. Just give me a day. Let me make sure this is really what we both want, not just what seems necessary. Elena nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. Fear that he'd choose the ranch over her after all. Fear that she'd offered herself and he'd find her wanting. He wanted to reassure her, to pull her close and promise everything would work out. But Silas had learned long ago that promises were only worth what you could guarantee. And right now he couldn't guarantee anything except that the world they'd built together was falling apart. The next morning brought news that made the decision for him. Tom came to the house just after dawn, his face grim. We have a problem. Someone cut the fence on the south pasture last night. 60 head of cattle gone. Silas felt ice flood his veins. Gone where? Driven off, looks like. Professional job. Whoever did it knew what they were doing and did it quietly enough that none of the hands heard anything. Wickham. Can't prove it, but the timing's suspicious. It was more than suspicious. It was a message. A demonstration that the economic pressure could become something worse. That if Silas wouldn't back down, the people opposing him were willing to escalate. Elena appeared in the hallway, having heard the conversation. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. This is because of me. This is because some people would rather destroy what they can't control, Silas corrected. He looked at Tom. Get the hands organized. I want those cattle found, and I want extra patrols on all the fences tonight. Already on it. But, Silas, this could get worse before it gets better. I know. Tom left, and Silas turned to find Elena watching him with an expression that was part determination, part desperation. We're out of time, she said. We need to make a decision. Silas thought about the ranch he'd built, the life he'd carved out of Wyoming wilderness, the reputation he'd accumulated over 20 years of brutal work. Thought about losing it all to men who couldn't see past their own small-minded prejudices. Then he thought about losing Elena, about watching her walk away to protect him, disappearing into whatever uncertain future waited for a woman alone in the territories, about going back to the hollow existence he'd been living before she arrived. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. All right, he said, we get married, but we do it properly, not some rushed ceremony in the middle of the night. We announce it publicly, make it clear this is what we both want, and we dare anyone to make something of it. Elena's eyes widened. You're sure? No, but I'm sure that losing you would be worse than anything Wickham and his allies can do to me. So yes, let's get married. Let's show them exactly what they're up against. Relief and terror warred across her face. When? As soon as we can arrange it. This week if possible. Before they can organize more sabotage or apply more pressure. He caught her hands. Elena, are you sure about this? Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be tied to me, to this ranch, to whatever consequences come from standing against them. I've been sure since the moment I suggested it, maybe even before that. She squeezed his hands. I'm not afraid of consequences, Silas. I'm afraid of running away and spending the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. Then we'll find out together. He pulled her close, and she came willingly, burying her face against his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other against the storm they could both feel building. News of their engagement spread through the territory like wildfire, and the reaction was exactly what Elena had feared and Silas had expected. Outrage from some quarters, satisfaction from others who saw it as confirmation of everything they'd suspected, calculation from people trying to figure out how to use the development to their advantage. Samuel Wickham's response came in the form of a letter delivered 2 days after the announcement. Silas read it at the breakfast table while Elena watched, trying to gauge his reaction. "Well?" she asked when he set it down. "He's calling for a territorial council meeting. Formal complaints about moral conduct, abuse of influence, corruption of community standards. He's making this official. Can they actually do anything? They can make recommendations, apply pressure, make it difficult for me to do business in the territory." Silas refolded the letter with careful precision. "But they can't stop a legal marriage, and that's what matters." "When is the meeting?" 2 weeks from now, which gives us time to get married first, establish it as fact rather than speculation. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You realize this looks exactly like what they're accusing us of, like we're rushing into marriage to legitimize something improper. Let them think what they want. The truth is we're getting married because we want to. The timing's strategic, but the reasons aren't." "You're sure about that?" Silas looked at her directly. "Are you asking if I'm marrying you just to solve a problem? Because the answer's no. I'm marrying you because the thought of not marrying you is worse than anything the Territorial Council can threaten me with." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this was more than strategy, more than two people backed into a corner and taking the only exit they could see. But doubt crept in anyway, whispering that rushed marriages built on external pressure rarely ended well. "What if this makes everything worse?" she asked quietly. "Then it makes everything worse, and we deal with it together. That's what marriage means." The ceremony itself was small and deliberately public. Silas arranged it for the following Saturday, in town, at the courthouse where marriages were officially recorded. He invited witnesses, some ranch hands, Mary and Tom Bridger, a few business associates who hadn't yet turned against him. He specifically made sure word reached Wickham and Hartford, making it clear this wasn't a secret ceremony but a public declaration. Elena wore the blue dress she'd made for the Hartford gathering, and Silas wore his best suit. They stood before Judge Morrison, the doctor's brother, and one of the few officials who'd remained neutral in the growing conflict, and spoke vows that felt both weightless and heavy as iron. "Do you, Silas Mercer, take Elena Voss to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "And do you, Elena Voss, take Silas Mercer to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elena looked at Silas, at this man who'd saved her life and given her purpose, and was now binding his future to hers in front of everyone who'd spent months questioning their relationship. "I do." The kiss that sealed it was brief and chaste, appropriate for a public ceremony. But when Silas's lips brushed hers, Elena felt something shift deep in her chest, some fundamental acceptance that this was real now, that whatever happened next they'd face it as husband and wife, not just as allies. The witnesses applauded politely. Tom shook Silas's hand. Mary hugged Elena hard enough to hurt, whispering "good luck" in a tone that suggested they'd need it. They left the courthouse as man and wife, and Elena saw the crowd that had gathered to watch. Some faces were friendly, others were hostile. Most were simply curious, wanting to see what the wealthy rancher and his scandalous bride looked like officially joined. Samuel Wickham stood near the back, his expression calculating. He caught Silas's eye and offered the smallest nod. Acknowledgement, maybe, that this round had gone to them. But there was no surrender in his posture, just the patience of someone who knew the game was far from over. That night, back at Black Hollow Ranch, Elena and Silas sat in the parlor that had become their shared space over the past months. The house felt different now, charged with new possibility and new risk. "We're married," Elena said, like she was testing the words. "We are. And tomorrow we face the Territorial Council meeting with Wickham and everyone who wants to see us fail." "We do." Elena turned to look at him. "Was this a mistake? Rushing into this before we had time to figure out what we actually are to each other?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Ask me again in a year. Right now, all I know is that having you here, making this official, feels right in ways I can't fully explain." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." She nodded slowly, accepting that uncertainty was part of the deal they'd made. "Then I guess we'll figure it out as we go. Together. Together." Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the windows, vast and indifferent. Inside Black Hollow Ranch, two people who'd married for survival and maybe something deeper settled into an uncertain future, hoping it would be enough to carry them through whatever came next. The territorial council meeting loomed ahead like a storm on the horizon, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that surviving the wedding was just the beginning. The real test was still coming, and when it arrived, it would demand more from both of them than either had yet imagined. The territorial council meeting took place in the largest room the town had to offer, the second floor of the Cattlemen's Association Hall, a space usually reserved for livestock auctions and disputes over grazing rights. By the time Silas and Elena arrived, the room was already packed with more people than it was designed to hold. Word had spread that this wasn't just about one rancher's personal life anymore. It had become something bigger, a referendum on power and morality, and who got to decide which rules mattered. Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward them as they entered. She'd dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple gray dress that said respectability without trying too hard. Her hair was pulled back severely, and she wore the thin gold band Silas had placed on her finger 6 days ago. Everything about her appearance was calculated to present the image of a proper married woman, but she could feel the weight of judgment anyway. Silas walked beside her with the steady confidence of a man who'd faced down worse than gossiping neighbors, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set just slightly too tight. They took seats near the front, and Elena forced herself to look around the room. Samuel Wickham sat with his wife and several other prominent ranchers, all of them wearing expressions of righteous certainty. Constance Hartford was there too, her mouth pursed in disapproval. But there were other faces as well. Tom Bridger standing against the back wall, his arms crossed. A few ranch hands from Black Hollow. Even Doc Morrison, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but had shown up anyway, out of some sense of obligation. The council itself consisted of 5 men, all of them established residents with varying degrees of actual authority. Chairman Peterson was a banker who'd been in Wyoming since before it was officially a territory. The others were a mix of businessmen and landowners, the kind of people who made decisions by consensus and tried to avoid making enemies. Peterson called the meeting to order, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. We're here today to address concerns that have been raised about conduct at Black Hollow Ranch. Mr. Wickham has filed a formal complaint alleging moral impropriety and abuse of influence. Mr. Mercer, you're entitled to respond to these charges. Silas stood, and the room went quiet. There are no charges to respond to because nothing improper has occurred. Miss Voss, Mrs. Mercer now, came to my ranch seeking shelter after surviving an attack that killed 11 people. I provided that shelter, later employed her to manage my household, and 6 days ago married her in a legal ceremony witnessed by this community. That's the sum total of what's happened. That's a convenient summary, Wickham said, rising from his seat. But it leaves out the months of questionable cohabitation, the scandal you brought upon this community, the way you've flaunted convention and expected everyone to simply accept it. I've flaunted nothing. I've lived my life according to my own conscience, which is exactly what you and everyone else in this room does every single day. There's a difference between living according to conscience and living above the rules that govern decent society. Is there? Because from where I stand, the rules you're talking about are just excuses for people with nothing better to do than police other people's lives. Peterson raised his hand. Gentlemen, please. Mr. Wickham, what specific misconduct are you alleging? Wickham stood straighter, clearly prepared for this. I'm alleging that Mr. Mercer brought a woman of unknown background into his home with no chaperone, no oversight, and no regard for how it would reflect on this community. I'm alleging that he used his wealth and influence to shelter behavior that would be condemned in anyone of lesser standing. And I'm alleging that his hasty marriage is nothing more than an attempt to legitimize a situation that was improper from the start. My background isn't unknown, Elena said, standing before she could think better of it. It's just unfortunate. I was traveling west when my wagon train was attacked. Mr. Mercer saved my life. That's not scandal. That's basic human decency. Mrs. Mercer, Peterson said, you're welcome to speak, but I'd ask you to wait your turn. Why? So Mr. Wickham can assassinate my character without me being able to defend myself? Your character is exactly what's in question, Wickham shot back. A woman with no family, no references, no history anyone can verify. You show up half dead, insert yourself into one of the wealthiest households in the territory, and within months you're married to a man who should have known better. That's not romance. That's calculation. Elena felt heat flood her face. You don't know anything about me. Exactly. No one does. And that's the problem. Silas moved to stand beside her, his presence a solid wall of support. You want to know about Elena's character? Look at what she's done since arriving. She's managed my household with more skill and dedication than anyone I've employed in 20 years. She's earned the respect of every ranch hand at Black Hollow through hard work and integrity. She's turned a house that was nothing but expensive furniture and empty rooms into an actual home. That's who she is. And if you can't see it, that says more about your limitations than her character. Pretty words, Wickham said, but they don't change the fact that this situation has damaged the moral standing of our community. You've made a mockery of proper conduct, Silas, and your marriage doesn't erase months of impropriety. Then what do you want? We're legally married. There's nothing improper about our household now, by any definition. I want acknowledgement that what you did was wrong. I want assurance that you'll conduct yourself according to community standards going forward. And I want you to understand that wealth and influence don't exempt you from basic rules of decency. The room erupted in murmurs, people whispering to their neighbors, choosing sides. Elena could feel the tide shifting, could see the calculation happening in faces around the room. Wickham was giving them permission to condemn, wrapping prejudice in the language of morality. It was Tom Bridger who broke the moment, his voice cutting through the noise from the back of the room. This is horseshit, and everyone here knows it. Peterson looked startled. Mr. Bridger. No, let me finish. I've worked for Silas Mercer for 15 years. I knew his wife Catherine, watched her die, watched him nearly destroy himself with grief afterward. When Elena Voss showed up, half frozen and bleeding, he did what any decent person would do. He helped her. And yeah, maybe the arrangement looked unusual. But I've been at that ranch every day since. I've seen how they conduct themselves. There's been nothing improper, nothing shameful. Just two people who found each other when they both needed finding. Your loyalty is admirable, Wickham said, but hardly objective. You want objective? Fine. Elena's done more for that ranch in 6 months than most people accomplish in years. The household runs better, the books are cleaner, even the hands are happier because someone's finally paying attention to things like whether their gear fits properly. She's earned her place there through work, not manipulation. Mary Bridger spoke up from beside her husband. I've been helping at Black Hollow since Catherine died. I watched that house turn into a mausoleum, watched Silas turn into a ghost living in his own home. Elena changed that. She brought life back. And if that offends people's sense of propriety, maybe the problem isn't with her. Elena felt something crack in her chest. These people who owed her nothing were standing up for her, risking their own standing to defend hers. But Wickham wasn't done. This isn't about whether Mrs. Mercer is a competent housekeeper. It's about whether we as a community will accept behavior that undermines our standards. Today, it's unmarried cohabitation that we overlook because the man is wealthy. Tomorrow, it's something else. Where do we draw the line? We draw it at actual harm, Silas said, his voice cold. Elena hasn't harmed anyone. Our marriage hasn't harmed anyone. The only people being harmed here are us, by your determination to turn a personal vendetta into a moral crusade. Personal vendetta? You've been looking for a way to undermine me since I outbid you on the Patterson land 3 years ago. This isn't about morality, it's about competition and opportunity. You saw a chance to damage me and you took it. Wickham's face reddened. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. You want to talk about impropriety? Let's talk about the fence cutting on my south pasture 2 weeks ago. Let's talk about suppliers mysteriously refusing my business right after you started your campaign. Let's talk about who's really acting improperly here. Are you accusing me of sabotage? I'm stating facts and letting people draw their own conclusions. The room had gone dead quiet. Elena could feel the tension ratcheting up, could see Peterson looking increasingly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Gentlemen, the chairman said, these are serious allegations. Mr. Mercer, do you have proof of sabotage? I have suspicious timing and clear motive. Wickham's been trying to buy into my water rights for years. This whole moral panic happens to serve his business interests perfectly. That's slander, Wickham said, but there was something defensive in his voice now. It's observation. You want to question my conduct? Fine. But let's be honest about why you're really doing it. Elena watched the room processing this, saw doubt creeping into faces that had been certain moments before. Wickham had overplayed his hand, made it too obvious that this was about power rather than principle. Peterson cleared his throat. I think we've heard enough testimony for now. The council will deliberate and provide a recommendation within the week. A recommendation about what? Silas asked. We're legally married. There's no misconduct to rule on. A recommendation about whether your conduct, past and present, meets community standards. Whether the council sees fit to endorse your continued standing in business and social matters. It was political language for social exile if they chose. Not legally binding, but powerful enough to complete the economic isolation Wickham had started. Do what you need to do, Silas said. But understand that we won't be backing down. We won't be apologizing for living our lives. And we won't be leaving Wyoming territory just because some people can't mind their own business. He took Elena's hand and walked out of the hall, and she went with him, feeling the weight of every stare following them down the stairs and into the street. They rode back to Black Hollow in silence, both of them processing what had just happened. Elena kept replaying moments, Tom's defense, Wickham's accusations, the faces in the crowd judging and calculating. She felt scraped raw, exposed in ways she hadn't been since the wagon train attack. "I'm sorry," Silas said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "For what?" "For putting you through that. For not protecting you better from people like Wickham. You defended me. Tom and Mary defended me. That's more than I expected." "It's not enough. They're still going to rule against us." Peterson looked like a man trying to find a way to avoid taking sides, which means he'll end up siding with whoever applies more pressure. Elena stared at the landscape rolling past, familiar now after months at the ranch, but still foreign in fundamental ways. What happens if they rule against us? We lose access to most business relationships in the territory, become isolated, have to source everything from other regions, which is expensive and unreliable. It won't destroy us immediately, but it'll bleed us slowly. Unless we leave. We're not leaving. Silas, be realistic. If staying here means watching the ranch die by inches, then we find another way. We adapt, but we don't run. Elena understood the stubbornness, shared it even, but she also understood mathematics. You couldn't run a ranch this size in complete isolation from the surrounding community. Eventually the costs would exceed the profits, and then they'd have nothing. "There has to be a solution we're not seeing," she said. "Like what?" "I don't know. Something that changes the equation, that makes them realize attacking us hurts them too." They were still searching for that solution when they reached Black Hollow and found Tom waiting for them with more bad news. 3 more ranch hands quit this morning, he said without preamble. Said their families were getting pressure about working here. Said they couldn't afford to be associated with scandal. Silas's jaw tightened. "Who's left?" "Maybe a dozen loyal hands. Enough to keep basic operations running, but not enough for spring branding or any major work." "Then we hire new people." "From where?" "Word's all over the territory now. Anyone who takes work here knows they're making themselves a target." Elena felt the walls closing in. They were losing workers, losing suppliers, losing the basic infrastructure that made ranching possible. And marriage hadn't fixed it. If anything, it had accelerated the isolation. That night, lying in the bed they'd been sharing for less than a week, Elena stared at the ceiling and tried to find a way through the maze that kept getting smaller. "We could sell," she said quietly. Silas went rigid beside her. "What?" "Sell the ranch, while it's still worth something. Take the money and start over somewhere else where nobody knows us. This ranch is my life's work." "I know, but is it worth destroying ourselves to keep it?" He was silent for a long time. "You're asking me to choose between the ranch and you." "No. I'm asking you to consider whether there's a point where pride becomes stupidity, where holding on costs more than letting go. And if I'm not ready to let go, then we keep fighting, but we need to be honest about what we're fighting for and what it's costing us." Silas rolled toward her, his face barely visible in the darkness. "When I married you, I promised to face everything together. That includes this. I won't make decisions about our future without you, and I won't ask you to sacrifice everything for a piece of land. The land isn't the point. You are. Making sure we survive this with something left besides debt and bitterness. Then help me find another way. Because selling feels like surrender, and I'm not ready for that yet." Elena reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. "All right, we find another way." But lying there in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and the other way they needed might not exist. The Territorial Council's decision came 4 days later, delivered by Peterson himself in a written statement that tried to sound official and ended up just sounding cowardly. Elena watched Silas read it, saw his expression harden with each line. They're recommending that business owners exercise discretion in their dealings with Black Hollow Ranch, he said flatly. Not a ban exactly, but close enough. They're also suggesting that my participation in community decisions be limited until I've demonstrated a commitment to establish standards. Meaning what? Meaning I'm being shut out of everything that matters. Grazing rights committees, water negotiations, territorial legislature considerations, all the ways I've had influence in this region, gone. Can they do that? They just did. It's not legally binding, but it carries weight. Most people will follow the recommendation rather than risk being associated with us. Elena took the letter from him, read it herself. The language was careful, wrapped in concerns about community cohesion and moral standards, but the message was clear: fall in line or be ostracized. So Wickham wins, she said. For now. But this isn't over. Silas, maybe it should be. Maybe we've fought enough, and it's time to acknowledge we can't win this. You want to give up? I want us to survive, and I'm not sure we can do that here anymore. Before Silas could respond, Tom appeared in the doorway. We've got visitors. The Kensington family. They're asking to speak with you both. The Kensingtons owned a mid-sized timber operation northeast of Black Hollow. Elena had met them briefly at the Hartford gathering, middle-aged couple, 3 grown children, generally well-regarded in the community. She had no idea what they wanted now. Michael and Sarah Kensington sat in the parlor, looking uncomfortable but determined. Their eldest son, James, stood behind them. Thank you for seeing us, Michael said once everyone was settled. We heard about the council's decision. Word travels fast, Silas said. It does. And we wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with it. Elena felt a flicker of hope. You don't? Sarah shook her head. We think Wickham and Hartford are using morality as a weapon to pursue business interests, and we think the council made a mistake in enabling them. That's kind of you to say, Silas said carefully, but saying it and doing something about it are different things. We know. That's why we're here. Michael leaned forward. We want to continue doing business with you. Timber for repairs, fencing materials, whatever you need. We'll extend credit, and we don't care what the council recommends. Silas studied them. That's going to make you targets. Probably, but we've been in this territory 20 years, same as you. We've built enough goodwill that we can absorb some pressure. And we think someone needs to stand up and say that fear and gossip aren't good enough reasons to destroy a man's livelihood. Why? Elena asked. You barely know us. Why risk your standing for hours? It was James who answered. Because what happened to you could happen to anyone. Today it's about an unmarried woman living in a wealthy man's house. Tomorrow it might be about a business deal someone doesn't like, or a property dispute, or anything else that gives people like Wickham leverage. If we let them win this one, we're giving them permission to use the same tactics on all of us. Sarah nodded. We have 3 daughters of our own. The idea that a woman could survive something horrible and then be punished for accepting help, that doesn't sit right with us. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. You don't know what this means. We have an idea, and we're not the only ones who feel this way. There are others in the community who think the council overreached. We're organizing quietly to push back against the recommendation. How many others? Silas asked. 12 families so far, maybe more if we can convince people that standing with you won't destroy them. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was more than they'd had an hour ago. Over the next 2 weeks, the something started to grow. Other families reached out, some directly, others through intermediaries, all of them offering support in various forms. A rancher who agreed to share grazing rights, a merchant willing to extend credit despite the council's recommendation, a lawyer who offered to review contracts and look for ways to challenge the economic restrictions being placed on Black Hollow. None of them were doing it out of pure altruism. Most had their own grievances with Wickham or Hartford, their own reasons for wanting to resist the consolidation of power the council's decision represented. But their motivations didn't matter as much as their actions. Elena threw herself into organizing the resistance, using skills she didn't know she had. She coordinated with families willing to help, tracked which suppliers were still accessible, found workarounds for the restrictions that had seemed insurmountable. She became the face of Black Hollow to these new allies, and discovered that people responded to her directness, her willingness to acknowledge the situation honestly without wallowing in victimhood. Silas watched her work with something like awe. You're good at this, he said one evening, finding her surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. At what? At making people believe we can win, at turning sympathy into action. I'm just doing what needs doing. No, you're doing what I never could, building bridges instead of walls, making people see us as allies instead of problems to be solved. Elena set down her pen. We're in this together, remember? Your strengths, my strengths, we combine them or we lose. And if we combine them and still lose, then at least we'll lose knowing we gave it everything we had. The counterattack came from an unexpected direction. One of the families supporting them, the Daltons, who ran a large general store in town, proposed something bold. We're organizing a community gathering, Robert Dalton explained, visiting Black Hollow with his wife, Catherine. A celebration, officially, harvest festival, even though it's the wrong season, but really it's a demonstration, a way to show that plenty of people in this territory don't agree with the council's recommendation. And you want us there, Silas said. We want you there as guests of honor. Want to make it public and visible that you have support, that you're not isolated the way Wickham wants everyone to think. Elena saw the trap potential immediately. What if no one comes? Then we've just publicly demonstrated how isolated we really are. People will come, Catherine said confidently. We've already had 36 families commit, and once people see that, others will follow. Fear works both ways. Right now people are afraid of being associated with you, but if enough people stop being afraid, it flips. Then they'll be afraid of being on the wrong side. It was risky, but everything they'd done for the past months had been risky. At least this risk came with potential upside. All right, Silas said. We'll be there. The gathering took place on a Saturday 3 weeks after the council's decision in a large field between town and the Dalton property. What started as a modest proposal had grown into something bigger, families bringing food, musicians volunteering to play, children running between makeshift tables while adults talked and laughed and pretended this was just a normal community event. But it wasn't normal. It was a statement, and everyone there knew it. Elena and Silas arrived to find dozens of people already present, with more arriving every few minutes. The Kensingtons were there, and the Daltons, and families Elena had never met who'd heard about the gathering and decided to attend out of curiosity or solidarity or simple defiance. Tom and Mary Bridger found them immediately. This is bigger than I expected, Tom said, looking around with something like wonder. A lot of people were just waiting for permission to stop being afraid, Mary replied. She smiled at Elena. You gave them that permission. The afternoon unfolded with surreal normalcy. Food shared, stories told, children playing games that had nothing to do with territorial politics. But underneath the casual atmosphere, Elena could feel the current of resistance, the deliberate choice everyone here was making to align themselves against the council's recommendation. It was near sunset when Samuel Wickham appeared. He rode up with 3 other men, all of them looking grim and official. The music stopped. Conversations died. Everyone turned to watch as Wickham dismounted and approached where Silas and Elena stood with the Daltons. This is an impressive turnout, Wickham said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. I didn't realize so many people were comfortable ignoring council recommendations. We're not ignoring anything, Robert Dalton said. We're exercising our right to associate with whomever we choose. Last I checked, that wasn't subject to council approval. It is when it undermines community decisions made for everyone's benefit. Whose benefit exactly? Because from where I stand, the only people benefiting from isolating Black Hollow Ranch are you and Hartford. Wickham's face reddened. This isn't about business. It's about maintaining standards. Then why are the only people being held to these standards the ones you happen to compete with? Silas stepped forward. You've been trying to force me into selling my water rights for years. This whole moral panic is just another tactic. That's a lie. Is it? Because I have documented offers from you dating back 3 years, each one more aggressive than the last. You want my water access for your expanded cattle operations. The council recommendation was just a way to pressure me into accepting terms I've repeatedly refused. Around them, people were murmuring, making connections they hadn't seen before. Elena watched Wickham realize he was losing control of the narrative, saw panic flash across his face. You can't prove any of that, Wickham said. I don't have to. People here are smart enough to see it for themselves. Silas gestured at the gathered crowd. You wanted to isolate me, make me desperate enough to sell. But what you didn't count on was that not everyone in this territory is willing to let you manipulate community morality for personal profit. I'm trying to protect this community from corruption. You're trying to acquire resources you couldn't get through legitimate means. And you're using my wife as the excuse. Silas's voice went hard. That ends now. Either drop this campaign, or I'll make sure everyone in Wyoming territory knows exactly what you're really after." The two men stared at each other, and Elena held her breath. This was the moment. Either Wickham backed down, or this escalated into something that would burn them all. It was one of the men with Wickham who broke the standoff. "Samuel, maybe we should go. This isn't the place for this conversation." Wickham looked around, saw the faces watching him, calculated his odds. Whatever he saw there made him step back. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Silas replied. "You just haven't accepted it yet." Wickham and his companions rode away, and the gathering slowly returned to life. Quieter now, more thoughtful, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. They'd faced down the opposition and held their ground. Elena found herself shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting all at once. Silas pulled her close, and she leaned into him, letting his strength steady her. "We did it," she whispered. "We did. Together." Around them, the community that had formed around their resistance continued celebrating, and for the first time in months, Elena let herself believe they might actually survive this intact. Spring arrived properly after that. Not the hesitant false starts of early March, but the real thing. Grass pushing through mud, calves being born in numbers that made Tom grin despite himself, and enough work to keep everyone at Black Hollow too busy to worry about what Samuel Wickham might be plotting next. The confrontation at the gathering had shifted something fundamental in the territory's social landscape. Wickham didn't give up entirely. Men like that never did. But his campaign lost its momentum. Too many people had seen through the moral rhetoric to the business calculation underneath, and once that happened, the whole structure started to collapse. The Territorial Council quietly withdrew its recommendation 2 months later, burying the reversal in procedural language that let everyone pretend it had never been that serious anyway. Elena learned that victory in places like Wyoming Territory didn't come with trumpet fanfare or formal apologies. It came in smaller increments. A supplier who started extending credit again without explanation. Families who stopped crossing the street to avoid her in town. Ranch hands who showed up looking for work because they'd heard Black Hollow was hiring and the pay was fair. But the real work, Elena discovered, wasn't in winning the public battle. It was in figuring out how to actually be married to Silas Mercer now that they'd fought for the right to stay together. They'd rushed into marriage as strategy and survival, and now they had to figure out if it could be something more. The physical intimacy came easier than Elena expected. Silas was careful with her in ways that made her chest ache, and she learned the geography of his body the way she'd learned the ranch, through patient exploration and occasional surprising discoveries. But the emotional intimacy was harder, built on foundations of crisis rather than the slow accumulation of ordinary days. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one night, lying beside him in the darkness of the bedroom that was still getting used to being theirs instead of just his. "Regret what?" "Marrying me. Fighting for this when you could have just sent me away and kept your life simple." Silas was quiet long enough that Elena started to regret asking. Then he said, "I regret that we had to fight for it at all. I regret that you had to endure people questioning your character and my judgment. But marrying you? No. That's the one thing in this whole mess I wouldn't change." Even though we barely knew each other? We knew enough. We knew we didn't want to lose what we were building together. The rest we're figuring out as we go. That's not very romantic. No, but it's honest. He rolled toward her, his face barely visible in the dark. Romance is easy when everything's going well. Building something real when everything's falling apart, that's harder. That's what we did. And I'll take hard and real over easy and pretty any day. Elena kissed him then, not because it was romantic, but because it was true, and truth was something she'd learned to value more than poetry. The ranch itself demanded constant attention. They'd lost the cattle from the fence cutting and hadn't fully recovered those numbers. Some of their best pasture needed work after a harsh winter. The main house required repairs that had been deferred for years, while Silas lived there like a ghost occupying a museum. Elena threw herself into the renovation work with the same intensity she'd brought to everything else. She hired local craftsmen, specifically choosing people who'd supported them during the council fight, and supervised repairs to the porch, the roof, the second-floor bedrooms that hadn't been opened in 8 years. "You're turning it back into Catherine's house," Mary observed one afternoon, finding Elena directing 2 carpenters who were replacing rotted window frames. Elena paused, considering, "Am I?" "No. You're turning it into your house, but you're doing it the way Catherine would have. Attention to detail, focus on making it functional, not just pretty. Is that wrong?" It's necessary. Silas needs to see this place as a home again, not a shrine to what he lost. Mary studied the work in progress. Catherine would have liked you, I think. She appreciated people who got things done instead of just talking about them. The comment settled into Elena's chest, oddly comforting. She'd spent months worrying that she was somehow replacing a woman she'd never met, trying to fill shoes that weren't hers to fill. But maybe that wasn't the right way to think about it. Maybe she was just becoming the person this house needed now, and that was enough. By midsummer, Black Hollow Ranch was unrecognizable from the hollow, echoing place Elena had first stumbled into. The house buzzed with activity. Ranch hands stopping by for meals, neighbors visiting to discuss shared grazing arrangements, occasional gatherings that started as business and ended with someone playing fiddle while children ran through the yard. Silas watched the transformation with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. She found him one evening on the porch, staring out at the pastures where cattle grazed in the golden late-day light. "You're thinking too hard," she said, settling beside him. "I'm thinking that I spent 8 years convinced this place was complete, that I'd built everything worth building and all that was left was maintaining it." He glanced at her. "I was wrong. It wasn't complete. It was just empty. I'd mistaken wealth for purpose. And now I'm watching you turn a cattle operation into a community. Watching you build relationships I never knew we needed. Watching you create something I didn't even know was missing." He took her hand. "You've made me better, Elena. Made this ranch better. Made everything better." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm just doing what needs doing. That's what you always say. But there's a difference between maintaining what exists and building something new. You're building, creating, giving this place a soul it didn't have before." She leaned against him, and they sat like that while the sun dropped toward the horizon and the evening sounds of the ranch settled around them. These were the moments Elena treasured most. Not the dramatic confrontations or hard-won victories, but the quiet interludes where they simply existed together without agenda or performance. The Territorial Council held new elections that fall, and when the votes were counted, 3 of the 5 members had been replaced. The newcomers were people who'd attended the gathering, who'd seen through Wickham's tactics, who wanted the territory governed by practical considerations instead of moral grandstanding. Peterson kept his seat through political maneuvering, but his influence was significantly diminished. Samuel Wickham himself faced his own reckoning. His aggressive pursuit of water rights and grazing land had made him more enemies than allies, and when a drought hit that summer, several smaller ranchers banded together to challenge his appropriation of shared resources. The resulting legal battle revealed business practices that were technically legal but ethically questionable, and by winter Wickham's standing in the community had eroded to the point where he was the one being avoided at social gatherings. Elena took no particular pleasure in his downfall. Revenge was less satisfying than she'd imagined it would be when she was still fighting for survival. Mostly she just felt tired of the whole thing, ready to focus on building rather than defending. "Does that make me a better person?" she asked Silas. "Not caring about revenge?" "It makes you a practical person. Revenge is expensive, requires energy and attention that could go toward more useful things." Catherine would have said the same thing, wouldn't she? Probably. She had a gift for cutting through emotional noise to get to what actually mattered. Elena had stopped feeling threatened by references to Catherine, had started to understand that Silas's past didn't diminish her present, that he could honor what he'd lost while still building something new. It was one of those lessons that sounded simple but had taken months of actual living to internalize. The first real test of their marriage came not from external pressure, but from simple domestic collision. It was late fall and they were planning for winter operations, always a complicated negotiation involving stock movements, feed storage, and workforce management. Elena had developed her own ideas about how to organize things, based on months of observation and the accounts she'd been managing. Silas had his own systems, developed over 20 years and refined through trial and error. They disagreed, loudly. "You're not listening," Elena said, her voice rising in frustration. "I'm telling you that if we move the stock south now, we save 3 weeks of supplemental feeding costs. And I'm telling you that moving them early means we lose access to the north pasture grass, which is better quality. The feed cost is worth it." "Is it?" "Because the numbers say..." "The numbers don't account for cattle condition going into winter. Quality grazing now means healthier stock in spring. That's worth more than saving a few dollars on feed." "A few dollars?" "Silas, it's nearly $300. That's not nothing." "It is nothing if we lose calves because the cows weren't properly conditioned. You're thinking short-term savings. I'm thinking long-term health. They were standing in the study, account books and grazing charts spread between them, both of them red-faced and breathing hard. Elena felt her temper fraying, felt the urge to say something cutting about how maybe if he'd been paying better attention to costs all along, he wouldn't have been so vulnerable when Wickham attacked. But she bit it back, because that wasn't fair and wasn't true, and would just escalate things into territory they'd regret. "I think," she said carefully, "that we both have valid points, and we're too angry to hear each other right now." Silas blinked, clearly expecting her to keep fighting. "You're probably right. So let's take a break. Come back to this tomorrow when we're calmer and can actually discuss it instead of just arguing." "That's very reasonable." "I don't feel reasonable. I feel like throwing these account books at your head, but throwing things won't solve the problem." Despite himself, Silas laughed. "No, it won't. All right, we table it for tonight. Tomorrow we'll look at it with fresh eyes and figure out a compromise." The compromise they eventually reached, moving half the herd south and keeping half north, worked better than either original plan. But more importantly, they'd learned how to fight without destroying things, how to disagree while still respecting each other, how to be married people with separate ideas instead of just allies against common enemies. "We're getting better at this," Elena said that night, lying in bed after they'd finally resolved the dispute. "At ranching? At being married. At being partners instead of just survivors clinging to each other." "You say that like it's separate from survival. Isn't it?" Silas considered. "Maybe not. Maybe surviving together and building a partnership are the same thing, just at different stages." It was close enough to truth that Elena let it rest there. Winter came hard that year, but Black Hollow weathered it better than most operations in the territory. The combination of Silas's experience and Elena's organizational skills created efficiencies they hadn't achieved separately. Cattle losses were minimal. Feed stores lasted longer than projected. The hands stayed healthy and productive because someone, Elena, actually paid attention to things like adequate shelter and proper equipment. Spring brought its own challenges, but they faced them as a team now, with systems in place and trust built through months of working together. The ranch was profitable in ways it hadn't been in years, not because they were running more cattle or acquiring more land, but because they were running it smarter. It was early summer, almost a full year after their marriage, when Elena realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't said anything, waiting to be sure, not wanting to raise hopes or fears prematurely. But when Doc Morrison confirmed it, the same man who'd stitched her up that first night, it became real in ways that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She told Silas that evening, finding him in the barn checking on a mare that was about to foal. "I have news," she said, and something in her voice made him straighten immediately. "What kind of news?" "The kind that's going to change everything. Again." He waited, his expression carefully neutral, ready for whatever she was about to say. "I'm pregnant," Elena said. "About 3 months along, Morrison thinks." Silas went completely still. For a moment, Elena couldn't read his face at all. Couldn't tell if he was happy or frightened, or something else entirely. Then he crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms so tightly she almost couldn't breathe. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "Morrison's sure, I'm sure. It's happening. I'm going to be a father." He said it like he was testing the words, seeing how they felt. "Are you happy about that?" "I'm terrified." "And yes, happy. Is that allowed? Both at the same time?" Elena laughed, relief flooding through her. "I think that's exactly what you're supposed to feel." They stood like that in the barn, holding each other while the mare shuffled in her stall and summer light slanted through the gaps in the walls. Elena felt the future opening up in front of them, uncertain and difficult and full of possibility. "We're going to have to add a nursery," Silas said finally. "Maybe convert the sewing room. It gets good light." "That's your first thought? Room logistics?" "I'm a practical man. I deal with fear by planning." "Fair enough, then start planning, because this baby's coming whether we're ready or not." The pregnancy changed things in ways both obvious and subtle. Silas became obsessively protective, trying to prevent Elena from doing any work that seemed remotely strenuous. Elena ignored most of his concerns and continued running the household, though she did concede to letting Mary handle more of the physical labor. The ranch hands were universally delighted, treating Elena's growing belly like a communal achievement. Tom Bridger started building a cradle unasked, working on it in the evenings with the focused intensity of a man who'd raised 4 children and knew what was needed. The baby became the ranch's future made tangible, Proof that Black Hollow wasn't just a business or a piece of land, but a home where life continued, where generations could build on what came before. Catherine and I tried for years, Silas admitted one night, his hand resting on Elena's belly where their child was growing. Never could make it happen. We'd started to accept it wouldn't, and then she got sick. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what this means. This baby isn't replacing anything Catherine and I didn't have. It's something new, something we're creating together. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. The birth happened on a freezing January night, 2 weeks earlier than expected, and considerably more dramatic than Elena would have preferred. The labor was long and brutal, and there were moments when she was convinced she wouldn't survive it, that she'd come through wagon train attacks and social ostracism and economic warfare only to die bringing a new life into the world. But Doc Morrison knew his business, and Mary proved invaluable as a second pair of hands, and just before dawn, Elena heard the first cry of her daughter, and knew with absolute certainty that every terrible thing she'd endured to get to this moment had been worth it. Silas held his daughter with the careful reverence of a man who'd given up expecting miracles and been granted one anyway. She's perfect, he said, his voice breaking. She's wrinkly and screaming, Elena said, exhausted and elated. But yes, perfect. They named her Catherine Rose Mercer, Catherine for the woman who'd loved this ranch first, Rose for Elena's mother who'd taught her the skills that had kept her alive. The name felt like a bridge between past and future, honoring what came before while moving forward. The baby changed everything and nothing. The work of the ranch continued. Cattle still needed tending, accounts still needed managing, fences still needed mending. But now it all had different weight, different purpose. They weren't just maintaining a business. They were building something to pass down. Elena learned to balance motherhood with ranch management, discovering that the organizational skills she'd developed translated well to managing an infant's unpredictable demands. Silas proved surprisingly adept at late-night bottle feeding, walking the floors with Catherine when she wouldn't sleep, making ridiculous faces that got the baby to stop crying when nothing else would. You're good at this, Elena said one night, finding him in the nursery with Catherine sleeping on his shoulder. I'm terrified I'm doing it wrong. That's how you know you're doing it right. The people who think they know everything are the ones who break things. By the time Catherine was 6 months old, Black Hollow Ranch had fully transformed into something Elena hadn't quite imagined that first desperate night when she'd collapsed in the snow. It was profitable and productive, yes, but more than that, it was alive. A working ranch where people built lives, raised families, created something worth more than the sum of its assets. The final piece of business with Samuel Wickham came not as confrontation, but as transaction. His ranch was failing, years of aggressive expansion and questionable management finally catching up with him. He approached Silas that spring with an offer to sell his water rights, the very thing he'd spent years trying to force Silas to surrender. They met in Silas's study, the same room where they'd fought over council recommendations and moral standards. Wickham looked older, diminished, stripped of the righteous certainty that had made him dangerous. I need the money, he said bluntly. My operation's underwater. This is the only asset I have left that's worth anything. And you're selling to me because you'll pay fair price and won't gloat about it. I made mistakes, Mercer, big ones, but you're not the kind of man who kicks people when they're down. Elena, listening from the doorway with Catherine on her hip, saw Silas consider, saw him calculate the strategic advantage, the poetic justice, the opportunity to finally win the resource war that had triggered everything. I'll buy them, Silas said finally. Fair market price. But I have a condition. Name it. You stop the vendetta. All of it. You let people rebuild their own relationships with Black Hollow without your interference. And you acknowledge, privately, if not publicly, that the moral crusade was never about morality. Wickham's jaw tightened. You want me to admit I was wrong. I want you to admit you were strategic. There's a difference. You weren't wrong about your business needs. You were wrong about the tactics you used to pursue them. For a long moment, Wickham just stared. Then slowly, he nodded. Fair enough. I was strategic. I saw an opening, and I took it. I thought public pressure would force you into a deal you'd refuse to make otherwise. And instead, it nearly destroyed both of us. Yeah, instead, it did that. Wickham stood. We have a deal. We have a deal. They shook hands, and Elena watched a chapter close. Not with drama or fanfare, but with simple transaction and mutual acknowledgement of costs paid. After Wickham left, Silas found Elena still standing in the doorway. "You were generous with him," she said. "I was practical. His water rights are worth more to us than his continued enmity, and he's learned enough to stop being a threat." "You think people change?" "I think people learn. Whether they change depends on what they do with the lessons." Elena shifted Catherine to her other hip. "What did we learn from all of this?" Silas considered the question seriously. "That wealth without purpose is just numbers in a ledger. That reputation matters less than who you actually are. That the things worth fighting for are the things that cost you something to keep." He looked at her. "What did you learn?" "That survival isn't the same as living. That home isn't a place. It's people. That sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things we never knew we needed." She meant the wagon train attack, the months of struggle, the forced marriage that became real partnership. Meant all of it and none of it, the lessons too complicated to reduce to simple statements. "We should write that down," Silas said, "for Catherine, so she knows what it took to build this place. She'll learn by living here, by watching us. That's how the important lessons get taught." That summer, 3 years after Elena had stumbled out of the snow more dead than alive, Black Hollow Ranch held its first annual gathering, not a response to crisis or political maneuvering, but a genuine celebration of community. Families came from across the territory, bringing food and music and children who ran wild through the pastures while adults talked and laughed and did business. Elena moved through the crowd with Catherine toddling beside her, accepting congratulations and returning greetings, and marveled at how foreign this would have seemed to the desperate woman who'd fought her way out of the timberlands. That woman had been focused purely on survival, on making it through one more hour, one more day. She hadn't been able to imagine building something, creating community, having a child who would inherit all of this someday. But here she was anyway, having survived and built and created against odds that should have been impossible. "You look thoughtful," Mary said, appearing beside her with a plate of food. "Just thinking about how far we've come. From what I hear, you've come from a frozen night and certain death to this." Mary gestured at the gathered crowd, the thriving ranch, the life Elena had built. "I'd say that's worth being thoughtful about. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real, that this is my life now." "Believe it. You earned it, every bit of it." Silas found her as the sun was setting, Catherine asleep against his shoulder despite the noise and activity around them. "This is good," he said, looking out at the gathering. "It is." Catherine would have liked this. The first Catherine, I mean. She always wanted the ranch to feel like more than just a business. "I think we've managed that. We have. Together." He shifted Catherine's weight slightly. "You know what the best part is? Tell me. This isn't the ending. This is the middle. We've got years ahead to keep building, keep growing, to watch our daughter grow up in a place where she's safe and loved, to create something that lasts beyond us." Elena leaned against him, the three of them a unit now, a family built from survival and choice and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that the worst thing that ever happened to me was that wagon train attack, that surviving it was the end of the story. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. Everything that mattered started that night when I crawled out of the snow and found your door. You didn't find my door. You made it to my door through sheer force of will. Same difference." "No, there's a huge difference. Finding implies luck. Making it there implies choice. You chose to survive, chose to keep fighting, chose to build a life instead of just existing in the one you were given." He was right, Elena realized. Every step from that frozen night to this moment had been a choice, to accept help, to work instead of hiding, to fight for her place instead of running, to marry Silas, to have Catherine, to build this community instead of settling for isolation. "What if I'd made different choices?" she asked. "What if I'd run when things got hard?" "Then you wouldn't be here. But you didn't run. That's who you are. Someone who stays and fights and builds even when running would be easier." The gathering continued around them, music and laughter and the sound of children playing in the twilight. In the distance, cattle lowed in the pastures. Closer, ranch hands told stories and shared drinks and made plans for the season ahead. This was what she'd fought for, Elena realized. Not just survival, not just acceptance, but this, a home where she belonged, a family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back, A community that had grown from resistance into something organic and sustaining. Years later, when Catherine was old enough to ask questions, Elena would tell her the story. Not a sanitized version, but the truth. About the wagon train attack. About showing up at Black Hollow more dead than alive. About the fight for acceptance and the marriage born from strategy that became real love. About how sometimes the worst moments of your life open doors to the best things you never knew to hope for. But for now, standing in the golden Wyoming twilight with her husband and daughter, Elena simply let herself feel grateful. Grateful she'd survived. Grateful she'd stayed. Grateful she'd fought for this life instead of accepting easier paths that would have led somewhere emptier. The woman who'd crawled out of the timberlands 3 years ago had been looking for survival. What she'd found instead was purpose, home, and a future worth building. And if that wasn't the kind of transformation worth fighting for, Elena didn't know what was. Black Hollow Ranch would continue long after she was gone, she knew. Catherine would inherit it, would add her own chapters to the story, would face her own challenges and make her own choices. But the foundation had been laid, not just in land and cattle and buildings, but in the understanding that real wealth wasn't measured in assets, but in the lives built, the communities sustained, the love that endured through hardship. As night settled over Wyoming and the gathering slowly wound down, Elena carried her sleeping daughter inside while Silas checked the stock one last time. The house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming, everything a home should be. She'd survived hell to get here, had fought battles she never asked for, had built a life from nothing but determination and the willingness to keep moving forward when stopping would have been easier. And standing there in the home she'd helped create, Elena Voss Mercer understood that survival had never been the point. The point had been learning to live, fully, completely, without apology or fear. To take the broken pieces of what was and build something better from them. That was the real victory. Not the ranch or the acceptance or even the love, though those mattered. The victory was in becoming someone who could hold all of it without being crushed by the weight of what it had cost. Outside, Silas finished his rounds and headed back to the house, to the light and warmth and family waiting inside. And somewhere in the high timber where it had all begun, snow fell on the graves of 11 people who hadn't made it through that terrible day. Elena would never forget them, would carry their memory alongside everything else she'd survived and built and become. But she wouldn't let that memory define her, wouldn't let the worst day of her life eclipse all the good days that had followed. Because in the end, that was what survival meant. Not just refusing to die, but refusing to let death have the last word. It meant building something so full of life and purpose that the darkness couldn't swallow it. And as Elena settled into bed beside her husband, her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, the ranch quiet around them, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd done exactly that. She'd survived. She'd built. She'd created a home and a family and a legacy that would outlast whatever challenges came next, and that finally was enough.